The first light of morning slips softly across the thatched rooftops, casting a silver breath over the damp earth and low stone walls. In a small village nestled between fields and forest, the day begins not with the sudden chime of an alarm, but with the gentle stirring of life itself. There are no clocks to govern the hour. Time is kept by the sky, the faint glow on the horizon, the crow of a rooster in the distance, the gradual warming of the wind as it rustles through the early mist. This is how the day begins in medieval Europe, not with noise, but with a slow unfolding. A kind of waking that belongs more to the world than to the self. Inside the narrow wooden homes, warmth lingers from the night's fire. The hearth, the heart of the house, has burned low but not out. Ash glows faintly beneath charred logs, waiting to be stirred back into flame. A woman rises first, wrapped in wool, careful not to wake the children who still sleep on straw-stuffed mattresses tucked beside her. She moves slowly, lifting a pot to warm porridge over the coals. There is no rush. Morning is not a race but a rhythm, and in these early hours, the rhythm is steady and low. The scent of damp timber and smoke fills the air, mixed with the earthiness of packed dirt floors and the lingering sweetness of dried herbs that hang from wooden beams. In one corner, a few chickens stir in a wicker enclosure. A pig snuffles softly outside the door. The animals, like the people, are part of the household, not pets, not quite property, but woven into the fabric of everyday life, in ways both practical and personal. The boundary between home and world is thin. Doors do not seal, windows are mere slits or shutters, and the outside world presses in through every crevice, the cold, the light, the sound of wind over fields. By now, the village itself is beginning to wake. You might hear the first clink of a pail at the well, or the creak of a wooden cart being pushed down a narrow lane. Voices carry softly through the morning air, not shouts but murmurs, familiar greetings, small exchanges that mark the continuity of life from one day to the next. These people know each other well. A village in medieval Europe is not just a collection of homes, but a tight weave of families, stories, and shared survival. Most have never traveled more than a few miles from this very place. Their lives are rooted like trees in the land around them, a patchwork of fields, commons, woodlands, and winding paths. As the sun slowly rises, golden light spills through cottage doorways. A man fastens the rope around his ox's yoke, preparing for a day in the fields. A girl gathers kindling with chilled fingers, her breath clouding in the cold. A boy leads a few goats toward the edge of the woods, where they'll graze among the brambles. Everyone has their task, and yet there is a softness to these mornings, a kind of harmony between effort and stillness. The body knows what it must do, but there is no hurry in the bones. The day is long, and the work is familiar. Inside the church, the village priest lights a candle for matins, the first of many quiet prayers that will echo through the day. The church bell, if there is one, rings not by mechanism, but by human hand, a slow, resonant toll that rolls across the countryside. Even if the villagers do not understand the Latin spoken in the morning mass, they understand the pattern. Sacred time blends into the soil of daily life. The bell marks more than worship. It marks the movement of time itself, the rising and falling of each human hour. Not every village has a church, of course. In some corners of Europe, faith is practiced more quietly, more privately, blending older customs with Christian rites. In those places, mornings might include a whispered charm, a glance toward the sky, or a gesture toward a protective token hung beside the door. Spiritual life is not separate here. It moves with the breath, with the waking of animals, the striking of flint, the washing of hands. And so the village wakes, not all at once, but in waves. First the fire, then the food, then the feet on the road, each home a small world, and yet each world linked. The rhythm of morning flows outward like ripples in a still pond, until the whole of the village is alive with gentle motion. No part of the day is more sacred than this, not because of what is done, but because of how it begins, slowly, humbly, and with care. This is how life takes root each morning in the medieval world, in the hush before the labor, in the light before the heat, in the knowing, shared by all, that life is lived, not in grand gestures, but in the small repeated acts that open each day like a door. And as the morning lifts into full light, the village steps into the rhythm once again, not new, not old, but timeless, like the sound of distant bells across a sleeping field. In the quiet morning light, the medieval home stands as more than shelter. It is memory made visible, built not with haste, but with the rhythm of hands and seasons. Its walls are thick with straw and clay, its roof sloped under the weight of weathered thatch. To modern eyes, these dwellings might seem humble, even fragile, but to those who lived in them, each wall, beam and stone carried warmth, familiarity, and a kind of quiet pride. They were homes shaped by the land itself, by what could be gathered, grown, chopped, dried, and bound together over time. Step through the low wooden doorway, and you enter a space both spare and deeply alive. The air is cool, with a lingering trace of last night's fire. The floors are packed earth, smoothed not by tools, but by the slow, repetitive passage of bare feet and sweeping brooms made from bundled reeds. In many homes, a woven mat or a scattering of rushes covers the floor, changed periodically, scented with herbs like lavender, mint, or rosemary, to soften the smell of life lived close to the ground. Everything here is within reach. There are no upper floors, no private rooms. The structure is open, the divisions of space marked more by activity than architecture. Along one wall stands the hearth, the center not just of cooking, but of light, warmth, and gathering. Its stones are darkened with soot, its iron pot suspended on a hook, quietly steaming with the day's first meal. Above it, on a narrow wooden beam, dried onions, beans, and bunches of thyme hang beside strips of salted meat. The hearth burns low and steady, as it must throughout the year. Fire is life, and maintaining it is a skill passed down like a prayer. When to stir, when to feed, how to bank embers against the cold night's breath. Above the fire, a hole in the roof, sometimes little more than a slit, allows smoke to curl upward, seeping into the thatch, blackening the beams. It's not efficient, but it works. And over time, the smoke itself becomes a kind of protector, hardening the thatch and keeping insects at bay. There is wisdom in this design, evolved from centuries of need. The smell, the warmth, the flicker of flame on walls, all of it becomes part of the very texture of home. Look around, and you'll see walls made from wattle and daub, wooden strips interwoven like a basket, then smeared with a thick mixture of mud, straw, and manure. It's a process both crude and clever. It insulates against the cold, it keeps out the wind, and in its own way it breathes. These homes are not sealed from nature, they are an extension of it. In winter, they grow cold. In summer, they grow close. The people inside them are never far from the seasons. They feel them not just in the air, but in the walls themselves. The roof is thatched, layered with bundles of straw, tightly bound and carefully angled to shed rain. In a well-maintained roof, the outer layers dry quickly, while the inner ones stay snug and tight, creating a thick, warm cap over the house. Birds sometimes nest there, small creatures find their way in, but the people below grow used to these sounds, soft scrabbling, the flutter of wings, the distant drumming of rain. It becomes part of the background music of life. There are few possessions, a table of roughly hewn planks, a bench that doubles as storage, wooden bowls, pewter spoons, a spindle for spinning flax. Most things are handmade, not from a place of pride, but from necessity. Tools are passed from parent to child, often worn smooth from generations of use. There is beauty in their simplicity. A comb carved from horn, a cup turned from ash wood, a chest with iron hinges that holds not gold, but linen, candles, and precious salt. Above the hearth, a narrow loft may exist, accessible by ladder or notched beam. Here, grain might be stored, children might sleep up high, away from the chill below. But often, everyone sleeps together near the warmth of the fire, layered under wool, curled against one another, safe within the low and familiar walls. Windows, if they exist at all, are small and unglazed, covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters. They let in air and light when the weather allows, and shut it out when it does not. In winter, the dimness is constant. In summer, the golden light moves in slow arcs across the floor. Candles are rare and costly. Most families rely on firelight, on daylight, or on memory. Outside the house, the surroundings are just as vital. A small fenced garden grows leeks, cabbage and beans, hardy crops that nourish through long seasons. A midden pile gathers waste for compost. A well provides water. Nearby, a small structure houses animals, chickens, pigs, maybe a goat, and their sounds mix with the soft creak of the barn and the rustle of wind through hay. All of it is woven together, not as a matter of decoration or choice, but as a way of being. In the medieval world, a home is not an escape from the outside. It is a filter, a membrane, a breathing skin. The wind comes through, the sun leaves its trace, the hearth crackles, and the shadows flicker. Every object, every corner, holds purpose. Nothing is wasted, nothing is merely ornamental. Comfort is found not in excess, but in knowing that what surrounds you has been shaped by your own hands, or by the hands of someone you love. To live in such a home is to live slowly, not always comfortably, but attentively. The walls do not separate, but hold. The floor does not insulate, but connects. The fire does not simply warm, it anchors, it remembers. And in the quiet hours of morning, or the hush of late evening, when the village is still and the smoke rises straight into the sky, there is a sense, not always spoken, but always known, that this place, however modest, is enough. It holds the story of who you are, and in its glow, life unfolds one careful moment at a time. In a world without abundance, where seasons shaped survival and hunger never lay far from the surface, food in medieval Europe was both simple and sacred. It was not something taken for granted, but something earned, grown, gathered, baked, stirred, preserved, and shared with care. What people ate told the story of their place in the world, the soil beneath their feet, the calendar on the wall, the status they carried, and the quiet hopes that simmered beneath each meal. For most people, the villagers, laborers, and land-bound families, food began with grain. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, not a luxury or a side dish, but the main event. It might be coarse and dark, baked from rye or barley rather than refined wheat, depending on what the land could yield. The flour was milled locally, often in communal mills powered by water or wind, where each family brought their share of grain and left with sacks of meal. In some places, these mills were owned by the lord, and villagers were required to use them, paying a portion of their grain in return, a quiet, ever-present reminder of feudal ties. Bread was rarely soft or light. It was dense, chewy, and nourishing, baked into round loaves, flat rounds or trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as edible plates, soaking up stew before being eaten or tossed to the poor. To bake bread was an act of planning and patience. It required kneading by hand, resting, waiting for the yeast to rise, sometimes from wild air, sometimes from saved starters passed between neighbors. The village bakehouse, if one existed, might become a shared space, its stone oven fired by bundles of dried brush, its heat carefully managed, each family's loaves marked with a carved symbol to tell them apart. Alongside bread came broth, hot, hearty, and endlessly varied. The pot hanging over the hearth rarely sat empty. Into it went whatever the household had: root vegetables from the garden, dried beans, leafy greens, and the occasional bone or scrap of meat. Cabbage and onions were common, garlic and leeks even more so. In summer, fresh herbs added brightness. In winter, dried ones gave comfort. Meat was rare for most, not absent, but saved for special times or borrowed from preserved stores. A bit of salted pork, a dried sausage, or a chicken stewed on a feast day might lift a humble meal into something quietly festive. And then there was ale, the everyday drink of medieval life, consumed not for intoxication, but for safety. Water, especially in villages near livestock or waste, was not always clean. Ale, brewed weak and light, provided hydration without harm. Made from barley and flavored with herbs like yarrow or bog myrtle, before hops became common, it was brewed in small batches, often by the women of the household. Each brew was slightly different, its taste shaped by the fire, the grain, the vessels and the hands that stirred it. A good ale was remembered, a bad one tolerated, and in either case it was shared around a wooden table in the light of the hearth. Cheese, too, played a quiet role, soft and fresh in the warmer months, hard and aged for winter. It was made from goats' or cow's milk, curdled with rennet and pressed with simple tools. Eggs were gathered when chickens laid them, and milk was taken carefully, sparingly. Nothing was ever wasted. Even sour milk could become something useful. Even tough crusts could be softened in broth. In this way, food was a cycle, grown, consumed, returned to the earth, never hurried, always earned. In the wealthier households, in manor kitchens and castle halls, food told a different story. Wheat bread was white and fine, sifted to remove all trace of bran. Meat was far more plentiful: beef, lamb, game birds, fish, and the occasional roasted swan or peacock for extravagant feasts. Spices, imported from distant lands, brought warmth and complexity: cinnamon, cloves, pepper, saffron. These were not just flavors, but symbols, visible proof of trade, wealth, and power. Dishes might be dyed with bright herbs, or molded into fanciful shapes. Yet even here, at the highest tables, meals followed the same structure: bread, broth, ale, and prayer, repeated in different tones across class and country. Food was also shaped by the church. The medieval calendar was rich with fast days, over 100 each year, when meat, eggs, and dairy were forbidden. Fish, seen as a food of abstinence, took their place. In river towns, eel and pike became staples. On coasts, herring, cod, and shellfish filled simple wooden bowls. These rules were not always strictly followed, but they created a rhythm, a breathing pattern of feast and restraint, of indulgence and simplicity. On feast days, food became celebration. Loaves were baked in abundance. Honey cakes and fruit tarts appeared. Ale grew stronger. Roasts turned on spits. The village gathered together under banners or beside bonfires. Musicians played, laughter echoed. Even the poorest ate better than usual, if only for a day. These feasts marked weddings, saints' days, harvests and holy seasons, moments when time slowed and the ordinary was touched by joy. Children learned to cook not by instruction, but by watching. Recipes were rarely written. Knowledge was held in gesture and memory. How much barley to a pot, how long a fish should boil, when to pull the loaf from the fire. Cooking was improvisational, rooted in availability rather than abundance. But in this, there was also intimacy, a closeness to the land, a mindfulness of waste, a gratitude for the smallest sweetness. And so medieval people ate, not lavishly, but with quiet reverence. Bread, broth, ale, and time, the ingredients of survival, the flavors of memory, the warmth of community. And when the day's labor was done, and the fire crackled low, a final bowl of stew or crust of bread might be shared in silence. Outside, the stars blinked overhead. Inside, the meal lingered, not as a grand banquet, but as a small sustaining grace. There is a quiet beauty in a life not ruled by ticking hands. In the medieval world, time was not measured in seconds or slotted into precise blocks. It was sensed, felt, and followed, a living rhythm drawn from the sky above and the soil below. Most people had never seen a clock, let alone owned one, and yet their lives unfolded with remarkable order, shaped by the sun, the bells, the seasons, and the rituals that marked each part of the day. The day began not at sunrise, but with the first signs of light, a softening of darkness, the pale blush on the horizon, the awakening of birds. This was known as matins, the earliest of the canonical hours observed by monastic communities. For the ordinary villager, it marked the time to stir the coals, feed the animals, and begin the quiet business of waking. There was no single sharp moment when morning began. It arrived gradually, like mist lifting from the fields. People spoke of time in natural terms. Dawn, high sun, dusk, milking time, market day, the hour of prayer, the length of a candle, the shadow cast by a doorway. A person might say they'd return by next light, or that something should be done before the sun crosses the ridge. It was an understanding of time as a companion rather than a ruler, something to move with, not against. The bell tower, where one existed, helped to orient the community. Bells rang out the hours of the Virgin, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, each one corresponding to a phase of the day and a moment of devotion. These sounds reached across the rooftops and fields, weaving the spiritual fabric of the day into everyday tasks. Even those far from the monastery walls would hear the tolling and pause, if only for a moment, to murmur a prayer or lift their thoughts beyond the furrows of the field. Time flowed differently, depending on who you were. For a monk, the day was meticulously divided by prayer, study, and silence. The night itself was punctuated by sacred interruptions, midnight vigils, whispered psalms, the lighting of candles in cold stone chapels. For a peasant, the day followed the arc of labor. Light dictated action. When the sun rose, you worked. When it sank, you stopped. The length of a workday changed with the seasons, longer in summer, shorter in winter, bending naturally with the earth's tilt and the availability of warmth and light. Work was rarely rushed. It was demanding, yes, but steady. There were moments for rest, a pause to drink from a stream, a break beneath a tree, a shared crust of bread at midday. No one watched a minute hand. No one counted the seconds between tasks. Instead, time was held in the body, in the pace of walking to the fields, in the turn of the spindle, in the swing of the scythe. Repetition created a sense of timing more accurate than any clock. One learned to measure a task by feeling rather than calculation. How long does it take to grind a bowl of grain? As long as the sun sits low. How long to herd the geese from meadow to pen? As long as it takes to hum the same tune twice. In towns and cities, timekeeping took on a slightly sharper edge. Cathedral clocks, some of the earliest mechanical marvels, began to appear in the 14th century, great gears turning with slow dignity, driving metal hands across painted faces, striking bells that marked the hour in deep, echoing tones. These clocks were not precise by modern standards, but they introduced a new kind of order, a shared schedule for market openings, for church services, for civic life. Still, even here, time remained more fluid than fixed. A craftsman might measure a workday, not by hours, but by the completion of a task. A baker knew it was time to remove the loaf when the crust gave a certain sound beneath the knuckle. The seasons shaped time just as deeply. Spring brought a quickening, planting, lambing, the urgency of growth. Summer was long and golden, filled with work that stretched into the warm evenings. Autumn, rich and heavy with harvest, brought a slowing, and winter. Winter brought the great hush. Days were shorter, colder, and wrapped in wool. Time then was marked by the turning of the hearth, the tolling of feast days, the coming and going of solstice. It was a time for repair, for storytelling, for the quiet counting of what had been gathered and what must be stretched to last. Festivals punctuated the year like bright beads on a long thread. Candlemas, Easter, Lammas, All Hallows, each one a pause, a reorientation, a shared moment of time held in common. These were not merely celebrations, but clocks of the soul, reminders that time did not only pass, it returned, it circled, it repeated. Life moved forward, but it also moved in loops. Even sleep was shaped differently by time. In many places, people slept in two parts: a first sleep after sundown, followed by a waking hour of quiet reflection, prayer, or hushed conversation, and then a second sleep that carried them into dawn. This segmented sleep mirrored the rhythm of night, a breathing in and out of darkness. It was not feared, this midnight waking, but welcomed as a natural pause in the stretch of rest. And so, in the absence of clocks, there was no absence of order. The medieval day had a rhythm all its own, not divided into ticking pieces, but flowing like a stream, guided by land, light, and living memory. It asked not for punctuality, but presence. To live well was to live attuned, to the sky above, to the bell's call, to the aching in one's hands, and the fullness of a shared meal. This was time before timekeeping, and in its gentle passing, the world turned not on gears, but on grace. Clothing in medieval Europe was not fast nor fleeting. It was born slowly, from the earth, from animals, from the hands of women and men who worked with quiet skill and patient rhythm. What people wore was not just a reflection of need or status. It was a map of the land they lived on and the time they moved through. Every thread was gathered, spun, dyed, and stitched with care, often over many weeks, sometimes over entire seasons. In a world where new garments were rare and fabrics held value, clothing was not consumed. It was tended, repaired, passed down. To wear something was to live with it, to carry a piece of the world around you, woven close to the skin. For most people, the journey of cloth began with wool. Sheep dotted the hillsides and pastures across much of Europe. Hardy animals, well suited to the wet, the cold, the rough terrain. Their fleece was thick and warm, especially valuable in the long, damp winters. Shearing came with spring, when the days lengthened and the air softened. It was done by hand, with blades rather than scissors, and required a steady grip and practiced eye. The wool was not yet ready for use. It had to be cleaned, carded, and combed, a slow process of removing dirt, straw, and knots, and aligning the fibers into soft, cloud-like bundles. Spinning came next, a spindle and distaff, tools so ancient they seem almost elemental, turned these fibers into thread. The spinner sat quietly, twisting, drawing, spinning, winding, again and again, until the wool became long strands of usable yarn. This work was often done in the evenings, near the hearth, or while watching children, or between other tasks. It was part of the background music of life, a soft, steady rhythm that filled the spaces between daylight chores. In wealthier homes, spinning wheels appeared, their large wooden frames humming softly as they turned. But for most, the hand spindle endured, simple, portable, timeless. Once spun, the yarn might be dyed. Natural colors ruled the palette, soft browns, grays, creams, and muted greens. Brighter dyes, drawn from plants like woad, madder, and weld, required more skill and resources. Blue, red, and yellow could be coaxed from roots and leaves, but the process was delicate. The yarn had to be boiled with mordants, substances like alum or iron, to help the color bind. Some shades were difficult to achieve and marked by status. A deep indigo blue or a vivid scarlet might be reserved for the wealthy or the ecclesiastical. But even the softest tones carried beauty. A cloak the color of moss, a tunic dyed like faded clay. These were garments in harmony with the land, shaped by the same hands that dug its soil and harvested its herbs. Then came weaving. Looms varied in size and complexity. In some homes, an upright warp-weighted loom stood near the wall, with stones holding the threads in tension. In others, horizontal looms allowed broader cloth to be made. The work was meticulous, passing the shuttle back and forth, pressing each thread down, row by row. The cloth grew slowly, sometimes just a few inches a day, and yet, as the fabric emerged, so too did a sense of care, of something made with deliberate effort, destined to warm and protect, to wrap around shoulders and children and memory. Clothing styles depended on class, region, and climate. For peasants and laborers, simplicity ruled. Tunics and gowns were the base, long, loose garments that could be belted at the waist. Men wore woolen hose or breeches. Women layered aprons or overdresses. Undergarments were often made from linen, when it could be afforded, a cooler, smoother fabric, prized for its softness and cleanliness. In colder months, cloaks and hoods became essential. They were not fashion, but function, thick, heavy, and fastened with brooches or ties. Footwear was basic, leather shoes, sometimes stuffed with moss or straw for insulation, or wooden pattens to keep feet dry in muddy lanes. Among the nobility, clothing grew more elaborate, not just in material, but in cut and embellishment. Silk, imported at great cost, shimmered in candlelight. Velvet and brocade, woven with intricate patterns, adorned courtly garments. Fur-lined cloaks and sleeves, not only for warmth but to show wealth. Buttons and lacing became more common, replacing simple ties. Bright dyes, embroidery, jeweled clasps, all of it spoke without words, signaling status, lineage, and power. Yet even in these grand clothes, the foundation was the same: wool spun from sheep, thread woven by hand, stitches sewn in quiet repetition. For children, garments mirrored their parents but with smaller cuts and looser fits, often made from repurposed fabric, stitched together from worn tunics or outgrown cloaks. Babies were swaddled, toddlers barefoot, As they grew, they learned the skills behind the clothes, not only how to wear them, but how to make them, clean them, mend them. A good needle worker was valued. A skilled spinner could support a family. Textiles were currency, comfort and craft. Clothing also carried meaning beyond warmth. Certain colors marked religious festivals or mourning. A belt might signify marital status. A hood pulled low might signal modesty or humility. Among pilgrims, a scallop shell stitched to a cloak marked the road to Santiago. Among widows, a simple veil marked quiet grief. These small details told stories, not loud, but visible to those who knew how to read them. And when a garment finally wore through, when it could no longer be mended or patched, its pieces were not discarded. They became rags, stuffing, or tinder. Even in its final form, cloth had value. There was no waste, only change. To be clothed in the medieval world was not merely to be dressed, it was to be wrapped in history, in labor, in the slow art of transformation. Wool to thread, thread to cloth, cloth to life. Each tunic, each shawl, held within it the hum of the spindle, the warmth of the hearth, the dye-stained hands of those who shaped it. And as villagers moved through their days, in fields, in markets, in prayer, they carried that quiet legacy with them, stitched into every fold. In the soft morning mist, when the thatch still holds the night's chill and the soil is dark with dew, the life of a peasant begins, not with a start, but with a return. It is the return of rhythm, of known steps, of paths worn smooth by repetition. In medieval Europe, most people were peasants. They lived not in castles or courts, but in simple homes clustered near the land they worked. They were bound, not by grandeur, but by the earth, its moods, its gifts, its demands, and from that earth, they shaped a life, both humble and deeply human. As soon as the light allowed, bodies moved into motion. There were animals to tend, tools to carry, and fields to walk. For those tied to a manor, duties might begin with a visit to the Lord's land, known as the domain, where part of each week's labor was owed. This obligation wasn't measured in coins, but in time and sweat, plowing the Lord's fields, harvesting his grain, repairing his fences. The rest of the time was spent tending one's own small plot, narrow strips of land in the open field system, scattered rather than clustered, designed to distribute quality and hardship more evenly across the community. The fields themselves followed a slow and sacred cycle. In many regions, a three-field system shaped the year, one field planted in autumn with winter wheat or rye, another sown in spring with oats, barley or legumes, and a third left fallow to rest. This rotation preserved the soil, encouraged renewal, and allowed communities to depend, year by year, on some level of continuity. Each season brought different labors. Spring meant sowing and careful watching. Summer brought weeding and haymaking. Autumn required long days of harvesting. Winter, though quieter, was no less vital. It was the time of mending tools, threshing grain, feeding livestock, and preparing for the lean months ahead. Peasant work was deeply physical, yet rarely rushed. The scythe moved in long, practiced arcs. The plow creaked slowly through heavy soil, pulled by oxen, guided with gentle commands. Seed was scattered by hand, cradled in leather pouches, spread with a careful sweep. Hands grew rough, backs ached, but there was grace in the familiarity of it. A choreography passed down through generations. No one labored alone. Families worked together. Neighbors helped one another during the busiest times, haying, shearing, harvest. In these moments, the village pulsed as one, each person a thread in the great fabric of rural life. Women's work was no less demanding. In addition to tending to crops, women managed the home, grinding grain, baking bread, brewing ale, spinning wool, mending clothes, and caring for children. They might rise before dawn to milk the cow, carry water from the well, or gather herbs before the sun rose too high. Many women worked in the fields beside their husbands and brothers, their hands just as calloused, their pace just as steady. Children, too, played their part, scaring birds from crops, gathering firewood, chasing stray livestock, learning early the rhythm of responsibility. Life was not easy, but it was not joyless. Laughter echoed across fields, songs were sung during harvest, feasts were held after long days of labor. Rest came when the sun dipped low, and the last chore was done. The satisfaction of a task completed, of rows planted, of grain stored safely in the barn, brought its own quiet contentment. In a world where uncertainty hovered always at the edges, where weather could ruin a crop, illness could sweep through a household, or war might pass nearby, this sense of completion was a kind of peace. Seasons shaped everything. Spring was a time of hope, when seeds returned to soil and lambs filled the fields with bleating. Summer was long, golden, and demanding. Autumn carried a mix of relief and urgency, gathering the fruits of labor, preparing for the cold. Winter brought stillness and introspection. The snow muffled sound, the hearth became a constant companion, and the days grew short. Yet even in winter, work continued, wool was spun, tools were sharpened, stories were told by firelight. Life never stopped. It only shifted. Though peasants held little in the way of wealth or power, they possessed deep knowledge of land, of plants, of weather, of the quiet language of animals. They read the sky like scripture. They sensed coming rain in the wind's turn. They knew when to plant, when to reap, when to rest. Their knowledge was rarely written down, but it was vast, carried in memory, in gesture, in the calloused hands of those who had lived it. Most peasants lived close to their neighbors. Homes stood near each other, fields stretched beyond, paths connected every door. The village was a body, and each home a limb. News traveled quickly, not by courier but by word of mouth, across wells, in churches, at the edges of the fields. Disputes happened, of course, but so did friendships that spanned lifetimes, and networks of quiet generosity that saw families through famine and loss. Their lives may seem small from a distance, the same chores, the same days, the same fields stretching endlessly into the horizon. But within that repetition lived meaning. Each season renewed something, each year taught something. Each act, sowing a seed, baking a loaf, guiding a plow, was a link in a chain stretching back generations. The life of a peasant was not one of ease, but it was full of labor, of learning, of love woven gently through the soil. And when the day ended, when the last light faded, and the fields grew quiet again, there was comfort in knowing that tomorrow would come, and the rhythm would begin once more. Beyond the cottages and commons, past the scattered farmland and low-timbered houses, a different kind of life unfolded, slower in pace, yet layered with duty, formality, and quiet privilege. The life of a medieval lord or lady was not merely one of splendor or ease, but of structure. Power here came dressed in tradition. Authority was not shouted, but carried, in gesture, in ritual, in the way a hall was lit or a letter sealed with wax. Within the high walls of a manor house or castle, daily life moved to its own rhythm, one shaped as much by obligation as by comfort. A noble's home stood apart, often on raised land, overlooking the village and fields below. It might be a stone castle with towers and drawbridges, or a fortified manor with thick walls and wooden palisades. These buildings were not simply dwellings, they were symbols. They projected protection, wealth, and order. Within them, lords and ladies managed not only their own households, but the lives of those who lived under their domain. They were landowners, judges, hosts, and figures of loyalty to the king above and responsibility to the peasants below. The day often began at first light. Servants rose earlier still, stoking fires, drawing water, preparing clothing. For a lord, the morning might include overseeing estate matters, reviewing accounts from a steward, resolving disputes between tenants, inspecting harvest yields, or managing contracts of land and labor. These were not distant affairs. Though a noble might not till the soil, they were deeply involved in the business of the land. Their wealth depended on its fruitfulness. Their reputation depended on its people. For a lady, the day held different responsibilities, but no less structure. She managed the household, not with her hands alone, but through direction and presence. She ensured that the stores were well stocked, the fabrics maintained, the herbs dried, the servants properly assigned. In noble houses, women were expected to be literate, to keep records, and to write letters. Many knew the healing properties of plants, the symbolism of colors, and the quiet codes of courtly behavior. They were educators, mediators, and caretakers of both kin and legacy. Meals formed the quiet backbone of the day. Unlike the peasant table, practical and sparse, noble dining was a performance of place and order. The great hall, with its long wooden tables and high ceilings, served as the setting. Meals were served on trenchers or fine wooden plates, sometimes even pewter or silver, depending on the wealth of the household. Bread was soft and white. Meat was common, often roasted, spiced, or stewed. Fish was served on fast days. Ale and wine flowed in moderation. But the true mark of noble meals was not excess, but ceremony. A procession of courses, hands washed in scented water, grace said aloud, conversation structured by rank, clothing reflected status just as clearly. While peasants dressed for function, nobles dressed for display. Layers of linen, wool and fur shaped their appearance. A lady might wear a gown dyed in rich tones of indigo or crimson, her sleeves trailing, her girdle embroidered with gold thread. A lord might don a tunic of deep green, trimmed with sable, his cloak clasped with a brooch bearing his family crest. Clothing not only kept them warm, it told others who they were. Tailoring, color, and fabric were all signs carefully chosen and understood. Yet, for all its elegance, noble life required discipline. Young lords were trained from childhood in the arts of war, governance, and rhetoric. Boys of noble birth might be sent to other households as pages, learning the customs of chivalry and loyalty, the use of arms, and the etiquette of high society. Girls learned needlework, reading, music, and the delicate art of navigating alliances through marriage. A noble family was a political body, as much as a domestic one, and every son or daughter carried the weight of legacy. When duties were done, the day opened to leisure, a concept far different from modern relaxation. Noble pastimes were often structured, tied to culture, performance, or practice. Hunting was one such pursuit, blending utility with prestige. A hunt was not only about the capture of game, it was a ritual. The preparation of hounds, the sounding of horns, the gathering of riders, a way to display skill, wealth, and status while providing meat for the household. Falconry, too, was a noble art, filled with symbolism and subtle hierarchy. To train a bird of prey required patience and trust, a quiet dialogue between human and creature. Indoors, music filled the space between meals and meetings. Lutes, harps, and voices echoed through high ceilings. Poems were recited. Sagas told, tapestries woven with scenes of saints and legends, adorned the walls, not just for warmth, but to educate and impress. Reading was possible, though books were still rare and precious, often handwritten, illuminated, and chained to lecterns for safekeeping. The chapel was another center of noble life. Whether built into the home or visited nearby, it offered a space for reflection, prayer, and the marking of time. Baptisms, weddings, masses, funerals, all passed through this sacred threshold. Faith shaped the rhythm of the noble household, just as it did for the village, binding both high and low in the same seasonal cycle of worship and wonder. Despite the walls and finery, noble life was not without vulnerability. Disease crossed class lines. War drew nobles to battlefields and left homes behind. Political shifts could bring favor one year, exile the next. And yet within these stone halls, life persisted, structured, adorned, ordered, not with chaos, but with quiet ceremony. And so the life of a lord and lady moved steadily, through meetings and meals, through letters and lands, through feasts and falcons, songs and symbols. A life not loud, but layered, and within those layers, a rhythm just as steady as the fields below. A different tempo perhaps, but one that still pulsed with the turning of the seasons and the long unfolding story of medieval time. In the shaded corners of village lanes, beside the low garden walls, and under the watchful gaze of thatched rooftops, the laughter of children once rang out, light and fleeting, like birdsong on the breeze. Though the medieval world was a place of labor, tradition, and survival, it was also home to childhood, not the modern invention of toys and schooling, but a slower, more grounded experience. Here, childhood was not a destination, but a path, a quiet unfolding from dependence to contribution, shaped by the rhythms of the home, the seasons of the land, and the stories whispered before sleep. Children in medieval Europe were born into lives already in motion. The moment they entered the world, they became part of the household's living rhythm. Infants were swaddled tightly in linen, their limbs wrapped to encourage strength and stillness. A cradle by the hearth, a sling on a mother's hip, a woven basket beneath the loom. A baby was rarely alone. Life continued around them. Fires tended, grain ground, fields walked. Their earliest memories, though wordless, were woven from warmth, motion, and sound. In their earliest years, children were cared for primarily by mothers, sisters, grandmothers, or wet nurses, depending on the family's resources. The line between work and care was fluid. A mother might shell peas with a baby in her lap. A sister might rock a cradle with her foot while carding wool. In larger households, nurses or governesses guided the youngest ones. But regardless of class, the village itself helped raise a child, neighbors watching out, older children pulling the younger away from danger, knowledge passed hand to hand like an heirloom spoon. By the age of 5 or 6, most children began to help, not with the heavy work of adults, but with tasks scaled to their size. A child might gather eggs, carry firewood, shoo birds from the wheat, or stir the pot at the hearth. In this way, work and play overlapped. A task done with care became a point of pride. Imitating adults was one of the oldest games. A little girl wrapping a doll in cloth echoed her mother's care. A boy guiding a stick as if it were a plow learned the shape of future labor. They learned not through instruction, but through observation, quietly absorbing the rhythms of daily life. But even in a world of chores and duty, there was time for joy. Children played with what was available, carved wooden animals, rag dolls stuffed with straw, hoops rolled with sticks, and cloth balls sewn from scraps. Pebbles became livestock, twigs became knights, Bones from the kitchen became counting tools or game pieces. In towns, market stalls offered simple toys, whistles, spinning tops, miniature swords, often carved by hand and sold for pennies. Richer families might afford more elaborate items, painted hobby horses, puzzles, or even early board games traced from ancient origins. Group games filled the open spaces. Boys and girls ran barefoot through the fields, laughing through games of tag, leapfrog, or blind man's bluff. They sang rhymes, danced in circles, chased geese. Some games mimicked battle, others told stories. Seasonal games marked festivals, maypole dances in spring, snowball fights in winter, games of bowls or ball during feast days. Children's play echoed the world around them, but it also gave them a world of their own, one not burdened by survival, but lifted by imagination. Education varied widely. In villages, most children did not learn to read or write, though some learned to recognize symbols, numbers, or prayers by heart. Knowledge was transmitted orally, through lullabies, proverbs, legends, and listening. In cities, guilds or churches might offer schooling to boys, and occasionally to girls, especially if a child showed aptitude or came from a family of means. There they might learn Latin, scripture, and rudimentary math. In noble households, education was more formal. Boys studied chivalry, logic, and languages. Girls learned music, poetry, and estate management. But always, childhood was brief. Most children began real work by the age of 7 or 8, and by 12 were considered ready to enter apprenticeships, servitude, or marriage, depending on their path. Despite these early expectations, childhood was not joyless. It was simply different. There was closeness to family, to the land, to one another. Siblings slept beside each other. Parents passed down skills with quiet pride. Neighbors knew every child's name. Illness, of course, was common. Many children did not live to adulthood. But this fragility did not erase the happiness of their days. If anything, it made their joys more poignant. Each game, each moment of laughter, more cherished for its impermanence. And so the life of a medieval child moved gently forward, from cradle to field, from rhyme to responsibility, from play to purpose. They grew not apart from the adult world, but within it, like seedlings growing beside the trunk of an old tree. They learned when to speak, when to wait, when to help, but also when to run, to sing, to imagine. For in every age, and even in the humblest of villages, children have found ways to be joyful, to make a game of dust and daylight, to find wonder in a wooden doll, and to carry laughter through the narrow lanes of a world both old and always new. As the first light of morning slides across rooftops and stirs the rooks from their nesting beams, the market begins to breathe. Even before the town fully wakes, there is motion in the square, the clatter of hooves on cobbles, the creak of wooden carts, the rustle of canvas stalls being lifted and tied into place. Market day is not simply a time to buy or sell. In the medieval world, it is a rhythm, a gathering, a quiet heartbeat that links field to town, maker to neighbor, village to region. In a world where most people live close to the land, the market offers something rare: choice, connection, and a glimpse of the world beyond one's own gate. Markets happened weekly in villages and towns, and more grandly in cities, sometimes with annual fairs that drew visitors from miles away. But even the smallest gatherings were filled with life. A long trestle table set outside a home might serve as a makeshift stall. A blanket laid over grass, covered in wooden bowls, onions, or hand-spun yarn, might become a business for the morning. Some markets were held in open fields or central greens. Others nestled within the town's protective walls, watched over by towers and steeples. The items on offer told stories, not just of labor, but of time, travel, and trust. A farmer might bring baskets of cabbages, apples, or leeks, still damp with the morning's dew. A butcher offered salted pork, tripe, or blood sausage wrapped in linen. Fishmongers displayed trout or eels packed in rushes, fresh from a nearby stream. Bakers arrived with trays of rye loaves or oatcakes still warm from the hearth. Brewers tapped barrels of small ale. Cheesemakers lined their wares in straw. The air was alive with scent, yeast, herbs, sweat, and the soft tang of livestock. Woven among these essentials were goods shaped more by skill than soil. Pottery glazed in muted greens, iron tools hand-forged and cooled in barrels of water, wooden spoons smoothed to a gentle shine. Women sold flax thread by the skein, honey in small clay pots, eggs gathered in wicker baskets. Children darted between stalls, eyes wide at sweets made of dates or nuts, or ribbons dyed in bright colors reserved for feast days. And from the edges came voices, sellers calling out their wares, customers bartering gently, and the occasional song drifting from a lute or pipe. Merchants, though fewer in number, added something more expansive to the market's rhythm. They arrived from beyond the village, sometimes from distant cities or even other countries. Their carts carried goods unfamiliar to most: fine cloth from Flanders, spices from the Levant, salt from the mines of Lunenburg, or tin from Cornwall. They brought not only goods but tales of foreign ships, strange coins, new customs. Their presence reminded villagers that the world was vast and interconnected, even if most would never leave their home valley. The rules of trade were shaped by custom and law. In some places, a bell marked the official opening and closing of market hours. Weights and measures were overseen by a reeve or bailiff, ensuring fairness. Prices, while negotiable, often followed seasonal logic. Turnips were cheaper after the first frost. Wool fetched more just before winter. Bargaining was expected, but done with quiet respect. A buyer might tilt their head, frown thoughtfully, then offer a coin and a look. A seller might smile, shrug and nod. No need for shouting or pressure, just the gentle dance of exchange. Money came in many forms: small copper coins, pennies or farthings, passed quickly from hand to hand. Larger sums might be kept in purses tied beneath belts or hidden within layers of cloth. But barter remained common, especially in smaller communities. A skein of spun wool might be traded for a dozen eggs. A piglet for a cloak. Trust mattered as much as currency. A known neighbor might offer credit. A traveling stranger might be asked to pay in advance. For those unable to buy, the market still held meaning. It was a place to see, to listen, to feel part of something larger. Elders came to sit on benches, to watch and talk. Priests came to bless goods or remind of feast days. Children saw faces they knew only by name. News traveled quickly here, of births, deaths, marriages, disputes. The market square became a kind of communal memory, renewed each week in dust and sunlight. Seasonal fairs expanded this experience. These were grander events, held on saints' days or during harvest festivals. They might last for several days, drawing vendors, entertainers and pilgrims from afar. Tents lined the roads. Jugglers performed. Musicians played beneath painted banners. Games were played, fortunes told, grievances settled. For many it was the highlight of the year, a time to dress in one's best, to see what lay beyond the fields, to taste foods otherwise unaffordable, to gather stories that would last through the winter. Yet even in these grand events, the essence remained the same: exchange, encounter, community. The market was never just about goods. It was about presence, about showing up, week after week, to witness the unfolding of the human world in motion, in hands passing coins, in carts creaking under weight, in laughter exchanged over the price of onions. And so the market remained, part ritual, part necessity, part celebration. A place where time could pause, where neighbors met as equals, and where the vast, slow story of medieval life found a temporary home in the clatter and color of a village square. Beneath it all, like the heartbeat of a resting town, was trade, quiet, constant and utterly human. In the hush of a medieval village, beneath the low arch of a thatched roof, or behind the heavy wooden door of a town apothecary, healing took place, not in haste, but in patience. In the slow simmer of herbs, the whispered prayers, the cool touch of cloth against fevered skin. Medicine in medieval Europe was not defined by precision or science as we know it today. It was shaped by tradition, belief, observation, and the rhythms of the natural world. It existed not only in books and teachings, but in the lived memory of communities, in the hands of healers, the shelves of monasteries, and the quiet wisdom passed from mother to daughter. Illness, to the medieval mind, was often more than a physical condition. It was something that touched the soul, the spirit, the balance of the body's inner elements. The dominant medical theory of the time revolved around the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These were thought to govern health, personality, and mood. An excess or deficiency in one humour could lead to illness, not unlike the shifting of seasons or the imbalance of weather. A choleric person might be fiery and prone to fevers, a melancholic, quiet and weighed by sadness. To heal meant to restore balance, gently guiding the body back into harmony with itself and the world. For many, the first line of care came from within the household. Mothers and grandmothers tended the sick with familiarity and calm. They prepared poultices of crushed herbs and warm oil, brewed teas from dried flowers, soaked wounds in salt or vinegar. Garlic, sage, nettle, and elderflower were trusted companions. Honey, prized for its sweetness and its healing properties, was applied to cuts and mixed with vinegar to soothe sore throats. Cabbage leaves were wrapped around swollen joints. Warm stones eased cramps. Leeks were crushed into salves. These remedies were not always cures, but they brought relief, comfort in the midst of uncertainty. In towns and larger villages, physicians might be consulted, men trained in universities, often in Latin, schooled in ancient Greek and Arabic texts that had been copied and preserved across centuries. They carried with them books filled with diagrams of bodies and lists of symptoms, but their treatments often echoed the humbler cures used by villagers, bleeding with leeches to balance the humours, prescribing fasts, baths or purgatives, or advising the application of cooling compresses. Diagnosis might involve examining urine, tasting it for sweetness, or holding it to the light in a glass vessel known as a matula. These methods, strange to modern minds, were practiced with seriousness and deep belief. Alongside physicians, apothecaries held an important place in the healing landscape. These were the pharmacists of their day, keepers of dried roots, bottled tinctures, scented oils and ground powders. Their shops smelled of rosemary, cloves, beeswax and old wood. Drawers and jars lined the walls. Mortars and pestles sat near windows where light helped identify color and purity. Customers came not just for medicines, but for counsel, for mixtures to calm anxiety, to lift mood, to encourage sleep or ease digestion. Some apothecaries were also herbalists. Others worked in tandem with midwives and surgeons. Barber surgeons performed more physical interventions. They pulled teeth, set broken bones, drained abscesses, and sometimes amputated limbs. Their trade was more hands-on, often messy, but vital. In towns, the red and white striped pole outside a barber's shop marked the place where both grooming and surgery were performed. red for blood, white for bandages. Though lacking in anesthesia or antiseptics, many procedures were done with astonishing care. Cauterization was used to stop bleeding. Trepanning, the ancient practice of boring a hole into the skull to relieve pressure, was still sometimes attempted, though rare. Recovery depended on many things: the strength of the patient, the cleanliness of the environment, and perhaps a bit of luck. In monasteries and convents, medicine was practiced with both faith and discipline. Monks and nuns grew herbs in cloistered gardens, tended the sick in quiet infirmaries, and copied medical texts with steady hands. The rule of Saint Benedict encouraged care for the ill as a sacred duty. Healing in these places was slow, surrounded by prayer, and often holistic, involving the body, the soul, and the sacred calendar. Fevered patients were bathed and read to. Salves were made from marigold and mint. Silence, rest, and spiritual reflection were part of the remedy. Many of the earliest hospitals in Europe grew from these roots, not places of medicine as we know it, but of shelter, solace, and care. Belief played a powerful role in healing. Illness was sometimes seen as divine punishment or a test of faith. Pilgrimages to sacred shrines, such as the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury, were undertaken in hope of miraculous cures. Holy relics were touched or worn. Prayers were said over the sick. Charms and amulets were carried, not as superstition, but as comfort. In a world where medicine was limited, belief was itself a balm, and when illness ended, whether by cure or by passing, it was met with ritual. The dying were surrounded by family, given last rites, and gently eased into the next life with candles, psalms, and whispered blessings. Death, though feared, was not foreign. It was part of the same natural cycle that governed the seasons, the harvest, the turning of the sky. Despite the limitations of their knowledge, medieval people cared deeply for one another. Healing was not isolated. It was communal, whether through a neighbor offering soup, a midwife delivering a baby, a monk mixing a tincture, or a mother holding a fevered child through the night. The effort to ease suffering was constant, woven into the quiet fabric of daily life. And so, in the stillness of sick rooms, in the scent of thyme rising from a pot, in the cool cloth laid gently on a brow, the art of healing lived, not in certainty, but in care. And care, above all else, has always been the beginning of medicine. Beneath the chime of distant bells and the long shadows of church towers, medieval life unfolded beneath a canopy of quiet faith. Whether in stone cathedrals or small wooden chapels, whether in the hush of monastic cloisters or the murmured prayers whispered before sleep, the people of medieval Europe lived their lives with the sacred ever nearby. Religion was not a separate part of the week. It was a presence, a rhythm, a gentle current that flowed through every task, every season, every breath. For most, faith was not philosophical or abstract. It was lived. It was felt in the soft light filtering through stained glass, in the scent of beeswax candles and incense, in the Latin words spoken by a priest, even when their meaning was not understood. It was in the act of crossing oneself before a meal, in the lighting of a votive candle for a sick child, in the act of kneeling on cold stone and murmuring a familiar prayer. It was a language of gesture and repetition, of sacred days and sacred places. The village church stood at the heart of spiritual life. It might be grand or humble, built of stone or wood, but it offered shelter to the soul. Here the community gathered for mass, for baptisms, for marriages, and for farewells. The church bells rang out not only to mark the passing of time, but to call the faithful to prayer. Matins at dawn, vespers at dusk, the Angelus at midday. The sound of those bells moved across the fields, and rooftops like a gentle reminder that life was not only about work, but about worship. The calendar was shaped by sacred observance. The week itself was ordered around Sunday, the day of rest, the Lord's Day. On this day, work ceased when possible. Fields were left untouched. Families dressed in their best, often their only fine garments, and walked together to Mass. Even those who labored hard throughout the week paused to reflect, to listen, to be still. For those unable to read, the church itself was a kind of book, its walls painted with saints and stories, its statues carved with meaning, its rituals enacted in sacred sequence. Feast days added layers of spiritual celebration throughout the year. The Nativity, Easter, Pentecost, Candlemas, All Saints, each one arrived with its own mood and customs. Christmas was not merely a day but a season, beginning with Advent, marked by fasting and anticipation, and extending through the quiet joys of Epiphany. Easter, preceded by Lent's long season of self-denial, broke open with light and renewal, bells ringing, flowers blooming, bread baked rich with eggs and honey. These days were not just about theology, they were about memory, about family, about the shared belief that the sacred walked among them. Saints played a vital role in the daily devotions of medieval people. Each community often had its own patron saint, celebrated with processions, blessings, and feast day games. People turned to saints as intercessors, heavenly friends who might understand their needs, who had once walked the same earth and knew the weight of human suffering. A shepherd might pray to Saint Genevieve. A sick child might be placed under the care of Saint Blaise. A student preparing for learning might light a candle to Saint Catherine. These devotions were personal and deeply felt, and many homes held small icons or relics, treasured and tended with reverence. Pilgrimage was another sacred act, a journey of body and soul. Some walked to nearby shrines, others across countries, to holy places like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, or even Rome or Jerusalem, if the path and purse allowed. Pilgrims wore simple clothes and carried staffs, their cloaks marked with badges showing where they had been. For them, the road itself became a prayer, each step offered in hope, in repentance, or in search of healing. Along the way, hospitality was offered freely. Inns and monasteries welcomed the weary, and stories passed from pilgrim to pilgrim, binding their journey to something greater than themselves. Monasteries and convents stood as the spiritual lungs of the medieval world. Behind their quiet walls, monks and nuns lived lives of contemplation, prayer, and service. Their days were divided by the divine office, 8 set times for prayer, beginning before dawn and ending with compline, the final prayer before night's silence. Their gardens grew both food and medicine. Their libraries preserved ancient texts. Their scriptoriums copied words by candlelight. Though apart from the world, they were never truly distant. Their prayers were offered on behalf of all, the sick, the lost, the forgotten. Their chants rose like incense, soft and unending, echoing down long corridors of stone. Spiritual life was not always serene. There were times of fear, outbreaks of plague, failed harvests, strange omens, when people sought meaning in the heavens. The church offered guidance, but also penance. Processions were held, sermons delivered with passion, fasts enforced. Yet even in hardship, the presence of faith remained a comfort. It provided structure in uncertainty, language for grief, and moments of beauty in the hardest of times. And at the heart of it all, in every village and city, in every home and cloister, was the personal faith of ordinary people, quiet, constant, and deeply human. It did not always speak in miracles or visions, but in small acts, the kiss placed on a crucifix, the pause before a prayer, the candle lit with hope in the hush of evening. The sacred was not set apart in the medieval world. It was interwoven with the soil, with the bread, with the turning of stars. It reminded each person, no matter their station, that they were part of something greater, that their life, however small, was touched by the divine. And in that understanding, many found not only purpose, but peace. Beyond the village fields and forest paths, past the bustle of markets and the smoke of hearths, the monastery rises, not as a place of grandeur, but of quiet intention. Its walls are high and weathered, its gates thick with iron and carved wood. A cloistered garden lies hidden within, and all around, the air feels different, lighter somehow, more hushed. Here in this sacred space, life moves to the sound of bells and the silence of devotion. The monastery is not a place of escape, but of deep presence, a place where the world slows, and the soul is given room to breathe. The day begins before the sun, long before the village rooster crows, or the mist lifts from the fields. A bell tolls in the darkness, deep, solemn, unhurried. It is the call to matins, the first of 8 canonical hours that structure the monastic day. Within the dormitory, monks stir from their narrow wooden beds, wrap themselves in woolen habits, and move quietly toward the chapel. No words are spoken. Their feet shuffle gently on the stone. Candlelight flickers along the walls, casting long shadows and soft halos as they take their places for prayer. The divine office, Opus Dei, the work of God, guides the monastic rhythm. At regular intervals, day and night, the bells call the community to pause and turn inward. Lauds greets the rising sun. Prime follows with the first tasks of the day. Terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally complime mark the passing hours. With each chime, work is set aside, tools are laid down, pages are closed. The body follows the soul, and the soul in turn listens. Between prayers, the monks engage in labor. This is not punishment, but a sacred duty, the balance of action and contemplation. Ora et labora, they say, pray and work. Some tend the gardens, planting leeks, onions, and healing herbs. Others manage livestock, gather firewood, or mend tools. In the kitchen, simple meals are prepared, often bread, lentils, vegetables, and cheese, taken in silence or with readings from scripture. Monks who are skilled with their hands may craft candles, shape pottery, or carve wood. Others work in the scriptorium, copying texts with slow precision, each letter drawn as if it were a prayer in itself. The scriptorium is a world within a world. Light filters in through narrow windows, falling across rows of wooden desks and inkwells. The scent of parchment, ink and beeswax lingers in the air. Monks sit in focused silence, bent over manuscripts, their pens scratching rhythmically. They copy not only sacred texts, psalters, gospels, and sermons, but also works of ancient knowledge, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and grammar. Each page is illuminated with care, margins filled with vines, birds, saints, or quiet creatures of the imagination. Gold leaf is pressed into halos and letters, glinting when the light catches just right. To write, to preserve, to beautify, these acts are not hurried. They are offerings. The library, though modest, is precious. Its books are chained to lecterns or locked behind wooden doors. Shelves creak with age. The monks read slowly, aloud or in the privacy of their minds, often returning to the same pages day after day. Learning here is not for prestige. It is for wisdom, for humility, for the long weaving together of thought and faith. Each word, each phrase, is read not to be consumed, but to be absorbed. Outside, the cloister garden offers peace. Its paths are swept clean, its hedges trimmed. A fountain murmurs in the center. Herbs grow in orderly rows: rosemary, lavender, sage and chamomile, both for healing and for prayer. The garden is not for display, it is for restoration, reflection, and silent communion with the natural world. Many monks walk here between tasks or during times of meditation, their fingers brushing the petals, their minds still. Silence, above all, reigns in the monastery. It is not emptiness, but fullness, a space where the soul can listen. Words are used carefully, spoken only when needed. Meals are often taken in silence, accompanied by readings. Conversations, when permitted, are gentle and low. In this stillness, monks learn to hear things missed in the outer world: the breath, the heartbeat, the shifting wind, the subtle movements of thought. They learn to dwell in their own presence, and in the presence of the divine. Visitors sometimes come, pilgrims, travelers, the sick, and the monastery opens its doors with hospitality. A guest house may be kept, with warm beds and bowls of soup. Monks offer prayer, shelter, and quiet comfort, expecting nothing in return. The rule of Saint Benedict instructs that all guests be welcomed as Christ himself. It is a rule lived not in theory, but in the gentle placing of bread on a table, the washing of a stranger's feet, the soft nod of greeting from a hooded figure in the garden. As evening falls, the community gathers for compline, the final prayer of the day. Darkness has returned, and with it, a sacred quiet. The chapel is lit by candlelight. The psalms rise slowly, like a lullaby to the soul. Each voice joins the others, not in performance, but in unity. And when the last Amen is whispered, the brothers return to their beds, to rest beneath thick woolen blankets, beneath the hush of stone and sky. The monastery is not a place for everyone, but its spirit touched the world beyond its walls. Its books preserved knowledge, its gardens grew medicine, its prayers gave shape to the hours. In its silence, many found peace, and through its steady rhythm, bell, book, breath, it became a quiet sanctuary in a world of change. Along the narrow lanes of a village, through the dew-covered pastures, and over the worn stones of a manor courtyard, animals were always present. Their hooves left prints in the mud, their low voices stirred the dawn, their shapes moved quietly through the edges of human life. In the medieval world, animals were not distant from people. They were partners in labor, sources of food, objects of reverence, and companions in a world that often felt vast and unpredictable. To live in medieval Europe was to live among animals, not just alongside them, but with them, sharing breath, shelter, and a mutual reliance that shaped every day. The most familiar were those kept for work and sustenance. Cows, with their slow movements and wide, dark eyes, were treasured for their milk. Their presence in a household meant warmth, nourishment, and when needed, strength for pulling plows. Sheep dotted the hillsides in gentle clusters, their fleece providing wool for warmth and trade. In spring, they were sheared with practiced hands, and their bleating echoed across meadows freshly green. Goats, hardy and nimble, offered milk and meat, and could graze where other animals could not. Pigs rooted in the forest's edge, feeding on acorns and fallen fruit, their presence marked more by sound than sight. A grunt, a squeal, a scuffle through leaves. Chickens scratched in courtyards and under fences, their clucks soft and constant. Eggs were gathered in the cool morning light, and their feathers lined cloaks and mattresses. Geese, with their alert cries and fierce loyalty, often served as natural guardians, raising alarms at approaching strangers. Ducks wandered near ponds or troughs, their waddling forms both comic and comforting. These animals were not only useful, but familiar, named, tended, spoken to, and grieved when lost. In the fields, horses and oxen carried the burden of labor. The ox, Broad-shouldered and slow was the steady power behind the plow, its harness creaking, its breath visible in the morning air. Horses, more costly, were prized in noble households and used for travel, war, and ceremonial display. A knight's steed was trained with care, fed on better grains, and fitted with bridles and saddles decorated to reflect the rider's status. But even in villages, smaller horses or ponies served to pull carts, carry goods, or bring children to neighboring farms. Cats lived in and around homes, keeping granaries clear of mice, and bringing quiet amusement with their unpredictable ways. They came and went as they pleased, half domesticated, half wild, but often welcomed and fed. Dogs were common too, not yet shaped into the many breeds we know today, but still distinct in purpose. Some guarded flocks, circling the sheep with soft barks and sharp eyes. Others hunted with their masters, or watched the gates of farmsteads with steady patience. A good dog was valued, remembered, and sometimes buried with ceremony when its work was done. Birds filled the medieval sky with presence and meaning. Doves, swallows, crows, and owls each had their place in story and superstition. Falcons and hawks, trained by falconers, were symbols of nobility and tools of the hunt, their hoods embroidered, their talons protected, their perches carried with pride. To train a falcon was a mark of skill and status, requiring months of patience and quiet bond-building between human and bird. In some monasteries, birds were kept as quiet companions, nightingales for their songs, ravens for their cleverness, each one watched with quiet wonder. Wild animals were both feared and respected. Wolves roamed the edges of forests, their howls unsettling but also strangely stirring. Bears, though increasingly rare, were known from story more than sight. Foxes darted through hedgerows, clever and elusive. Boars thundered through woods in packs, dangerous and revered. Deer, graceful and alert, were hunted for their meat, but also honored in symbol and legend, creatures of purity, of hidden pathways, of spiritual mystery. Animals also appeared in art and belief. The bestiaries, illuminated books filled with both real and imagined creatures, told of lions as noble kings, of unicorns as symbols of chastity, of dragons coiled beneath the earth. Each animal carried moral meaning, blending observation with story. Even ordinary creatures were layered with symbolism, the lamb with innocence, the dove with peace, the serpent with danger and cunning. These ideas passed from manuscripts to church carvings, from stained glass to folk tales told beside the hearth. Care for animals varied by place and time. Some were deeply loved. A farmer might speak to his ox as he would a friend. A child might cradle a sick kitten beside the fire. A noblewoman might weep for a favorite hound. Yet animals were also part of the cycle of life and death. They were killed for food, sacrificed in rituals of old, or used in ways that today might seem harsh. Still, there was a closeness, an intimacy, born not of sentiment alone, but of necessity and shared existence. In monasteries, animals often lived within the cloister walls, hens for eggs, bees for wax, sheep for parchment. Saint stories told of beasts tamed by kindness, wolves pacified by saints, lions serving in desert monasteries, birds attending the prayers of hermits. These tales, though embellished, reflected a longing, the hope that peace could exist between all living beings. And so, in the medieval world, animals were more than background. They were fellow travelers, shaped by and shaping the human experience. Their movements stirred the air, their voices marked the hours, their presence was a constant comfort, in the field, in the stable, at the edge of sleep. In a time before machines, before distant farms and sealed houses, animals lived close, not as strangers, but as kin. In the long twilight of a medieval evening, when work was done and the fields lay still beneath a deepening sky, music would often rise, not from instruments grand or polished, but from voices, from memory, from the quiet need to gather, remember, and feel. To live in medieval Europe was to live in a world where music was not a performance for the few, but a presence shared by all. It came not from stages, but from hearths and hills, from the mouths of mothers and the hands of wandering players. It lived in stories, in worship, in joy and in grief, woven gently into the rhythms of daily life. The human voice was the most common instrument. Everyone sang, even if not all were singers. Songs were learned not from written sheets, but from hearing, from repetition, from the closeness of breath, as one generation passed melody to the next. These were songs of labor and love, of longing and laughter, of faith and memory. A woman might sing while spinning wool, her voice soft as the fibers slipping through her fingers. A boy might hum while walking the path to gather firewood, mimicking the birds overhead. Singing was both a comfort and a compass, a way to mark the rhythm of tasks, to soften time, to hold the soul steady. In the villages, songs often echoed the seasons. There were planting songs and harvest chants, lullabies for children and dirges for the dead. Some were lively and communal, meant for dancing or clapping along. Others were solitary and slow, sung to the sky or to the quiet company of sheep in the meadow. These were not always recorded, but they lived for centuries in oral tradition, passed like heirlooms, reshaped slightly with each telling, yet holding the same core of feeling. In churches and monasteries, music took a more formal shape. Gregorian chant, calm, flowing and unaccompanied, filled the stone halls with sacred resonance. Sung in Latin, often in unison, these chants followed the divine office, marking the hours of prayer from matins before dawn to compline at night. Each note was part of a greater whole, rising like incense toward vaulted ceilings. There was no harmony in the modern sense, no showmanship, only a slow unfolding of sound that soothed the mind and lifted the soul. To chant was not to sing for others, but to sing with the divine. Monks trained in neumes, the early form of musical notation, small curved marks written above the lines of ancient texts, guiding the voice gently up or down. These notations did not dictate precise pitch or rhythm, but offered direction, a whisper of melody to those who already knew the tune. This system preserved hundreds of sacred songs, many still sung today, in echoes of that old devotion. Outside the cloister, music was more diverse and lively. Minstrels and troubadours traveled from town to town, carrying songs of love, chivalry and adventure. With lutes slung over their backs and satchels of poems and tales, they brought news, entertainment and color to the gray stretches of ordinary life. A noble hall might host such a visitor, rewarded with food, coin or shelter in exchange for an evening of music. Their ballads told of knights and ladies, of quests and longing, but also of common joys, the beauty of a sunrise, the loyalty of a dog, the sweetness of wine shared with friends. Instruments, while less widespread than today, added texture to the medieval soundscape. The lute and harp, delicate and melodic, accompanied songs both sacred and secular. The hurdy-gurdy, with its cranking drone, gave rhythm to dances. Bagpipes echoed across open fields in some regions, their sound both mournful and proud. Flutes and recorders, made from wood or bone, added brightness. Drums and bells kept time at feasts and festivals. Most instruments were handmade, unique in their tone and feel, passed down from player to player, worn smooth with use and memory. Music also marked the great occasions. Weddings were celebrated with lively tunes played by local musicians. Religious processions wound through streets with song and chime. Harvest festivals, May Day dances, and Christmas revels all brought people together with sound and movement. Even in grief, music held space, plain chant at funerals, laments sung by mourners, slow hymns echoing through cold chapels. It was how people marked time, framed emotion, and returned again to the deeper truths that words alone could not hold. And woven through all this was the oral tradition, the great river of stories carried in word and rhythm, shared by firelight, remembered without books. Tales of saints and sinners, of clever foxes and brave boys, of lovers lost and heroes found. These stories were often sung, or half-sung, in rhythmic cadence that helped them stay alive in memory. They offered comfort, warning, laughter and hope. A child hearing a tale by the hearth would grow into an elder telling it again, changing a phrase, adding a verse, keeping the spirit intact. This oral world was not secondary to written history. It was its own kind of truth. It preserved what mattered most to those whose names were never written down. It held the wisdom of those who could not read, but knew the stars, the seasons, the soul. It allowed communities to remember themselves, not in stone or ink, but in breath and voice. And so, music lived, not loud, not polished, but ever present, in the voice of a monk singing the night's final hymn, in the feet of children skipping to a springtime rhyme, in the song of a widow remembering a tune her husband once hummed, in the hands of a shepherd cradling a flute carved by his grandfather. It was everywhere, soft and steady, as constant as the turning of the sky. In the flickering glow of firelight, as the evening hush settled across stone walls and timber beams, love in the medieval world bloomed not always in poetry or passion, but in slow understanding, in shared labor, and in the rituals that brought people together under the same roof. For all its complexities and constraints, medieval life was still deeply human. People fell in love, formed families, raised children, and grew old in one another's company, not in ways untouched by hardship, but with moments of warmth, laughter, and enduring connection. Courtship looked different depending on where you stood in the social order. Among peasants and townsfolk, love often began in childhood, in shared chores, festivals, dances, or glances, exchanged across a church aisle. Two people might grow up alongside each other, gradually shifting from play to partnership. Affection grew not in sweeping declarations, but in the way one offered help in the fields, or saved a bit of honey cake, or repaired a garment when it tore. These gestures were small but full of meaning. In wealthier households, love was more often a matter of alliance. Marriage served property, politics, and lineage, a tool to secure land, settle disputes, or cement ties between families. Yet even in these arranged unions, affection could take root. A noble woman might grow to admire her husband's bravery. A lord might come to treasure his wife's insight, her patience, the steadiness of her hands. Time, in such cases, often worked in love's favor. The act of marrying was not confined to a single day. Rather, it was a process, unfolding through spoken agreements, symbolic gestures, community acknowledgement, and later religious blessing. A couple might become betrothed with the exchange of a token, a ring, a clasp, or even a pair of gloves. Consent was central. In theory, both parties had to agree freely, though in practice, persuasion often played a role, especially where land or inheritance were at stake. Handfasting, an older tradition still observed in many regions, involved the symbolic binding of the couple's hands with ribbon or cord, a public promise to live together, often before a priest could be found. Sometimes this temporary union was followed by a church-sanctioned marriage months or years later. In other cases, it was accepted by the community as binding in its own right, especially among those with limited access to clergy. When the formal wedding arrived, it was usually a modest affair, though it could swell with celebration. The ceremony often took place outside the church doors, where the priest would bless the couple before leading them inside for mass. Vows were spoken aloud, rings exchanged if affordable, and the marriage recorded, sometimes only in memory, sometimes in ink. Then came feasting, bread, cheese, ale, and whatever the season offered. There might be dancing, music, and the playful throwing of flower petals or grain. Guests gave blessings, toasts, and advice, some humorous, some heartfelt. It was not a grand performance, but a gathering of hearts around the hope of a shared future. The married life that followed was built on cooperation. Husband and wife worked side by side, in fields, in kitchens, at looms and workshops. Roles were often divided, but not rigid. A man might help bake bread, a woman might tend a flock. They raised children together, cared for aging parents, and managed the small economy of the home with care and ingenuity. Their days were filled with routine, but also with small joys, a warm bowl shared on a winter night, a story told beneath a summer moon, a child's first steps echoing softly on packed earth. Children were seen as both blessing and burden. They brought joy, but also responsibility and worry, especially in a world where illness hovered near. Baptism came quickly after birth, not only for spiritual reasons, but to anchor the child in the community, and in times of fear, to ensure salvation. Godparents were chosen with care, not only as witnesses, but as future protectors. Childhood was brief, yet filled with meaning. A child's laughter was a balm. Their questions, a mirror to life's mysteries. Their presence reminded even the weary that renewal was always possible. Family rituals marked the turning points of life. Birth was celebrated quietly, with swaddling and naming and whispered hopes. Coming of age arrived, not with parties, but with labor. When a boy could plow, when a girl could spin, when either could be trusted with the tools of the household. Death came not as a stranger, but as an expected part of the cycle. It was met with prayer, with shared silence, with candles flickering through the night. Widows wore veils. Orphans were taken in. The community adjusted, remembered, and continued. Even in hardship, love endured. In letters penned by lovers, separated by war, in carvings on doorposts, in flowers tucked into aprons. People found ways to express affection in quiet acts, a hand on a shoulder, a loaf left at someone's door, a song sung softly for no one in particular. Romance may not have looked like it does in stories, but tenderness thrived in the pauses between chores, in the spaces where duty and devotion met. And so, love in the Middle Ages was not a fleeting spark, but a low, steady flame. Marriage was not only about desire, but about survival, companionship, and legacy. Family was not built on wealth, but on memory and care. And though the world outside could be harsh and uncertain, the home, whether in a village hut or noble hall, remained a place where bonds were formed, held, and cherished in the quiet language of daily life. The buildings of medieval Europe rose not with speed, but with patience. One timber beam, one shaped stone at a time. Whether it was the low-slung curve of a thatched cottage, the timbered span of a village inn, or the soaring vault of a cathedral, architecture was not only functional, but quietly expressive. Each structure told a story of resources, of faith, of community, and of the deep need to shape space into something that felt like belonging. At the most modest level stood the peasant's home, a small single-room structure built with what the land could offer. The walls might be formed of wattle and daub, slender wooden slats woven together and smeared with a thick mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. These walls, rough to the touch but surprisingly strong, were both breathable and insulating. The roof was thatched, layers of straw skillfully tied and angled to shed rain and snow. Smoke from the hearth rose through a hole in the ceiling, darkening the beams with soot and sealing them over time. Inside, the space was compact but purposeful. A central fire pit or simple hearth offered heat and cooking, with benches and sleeping pallets along the walls. Tools hung from wooden pegs. Storage chests doubled as seats. Light filtered through narrow, unglazed openings, softened by oiled cloth or wooden shutters. There was no excess, but within these modest walls lived the essence of daily life: warmth, closeness, and the low murmur of voices at day's end. In towns and market centers, buildings took on more variety. Timber-framed houses leaned out over cobbled streets, their upper stories often overhanging the lower, a style that conserved space and sheltered passers-by. Painted signs swung gently above shop doors: a boot, a loaf, a pitcher, symbols for the many who could not read. Inns welcomed travelers with arched doorways and common rooms lit by lanterns and laughter. Blacksmiths' forges glowed behind thick walls, while weavers' homes hummed with the rhythm of the loom. Every corner turned in a town revealed some new angle of craftsmanship, some mark of hands that had shaped raw material into something quietly enduring. In the countryside, the manor house stood as a center of land and power. Often built from local stone or strong timber, it included a great hall, long, open, and echoing with the footsteps of those who entered. The hearth burned brightly at one end, and a high table stood at the other, where the lord and his household dined and held court. Above or beside the hall were chambers for sleeping, storage, and sometimes prayer. These structures were often fortified, not fully castles but defended with moats, thick doors, and small arrow-slit windows. The manor was not only a home, but a symbol of feudal responsibility, a place from which justice was dispensed and the rhythms of village life were directed. True castles, when they appeared, were born from both need and ambition. Their stone towers rose from hilltops and river bends, built for defense but also display. Walls were thick, stairways narrow and spiraled to favor defenders. Courtyards held kitchens, forges, stables, and sometimes chapels. Within, life was both hard and hierarchical, but also rich with ceremony and color. Tapestries softened stone walls, windows narrow for safety, were sometimes inset with glass, a costly luxury. Great wooden doors creaked open to receive visitors or close firmly against attack. Every stone bore the memory of hands that shaped it, of generations who passed through its gates. Yet for all their presence, even castles seemed to bow before the majesty of the cathedrals, the great stone churches that grew upward, year by year, century by century. To enter a cathedral was to step into another world. The air changed, the sound hushed, light streamed through stained glass in radiant color, painting the stone in blues, reds, and golds. Columns soared like trees, arches curved like the sky. It was a space designed not just to contain but to elevate the mind, the spirit, the very sense of time. Gothic cathedrals with their pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses balanced grace with gravity. Every part had purpose. The carvings along the walls, angels, saints, beasts, both real and imagined, taught stories to those who could not read. The rose windows glowed like suns suspended in stone. The organ, when played, filled the space with sound that seemed to move through the bones of the building itself. Even the smallest details, the curve of a stair, the echo of a footstep, reminded all who entered that they were part of something larger. Construction of such buildings took generations. Entire communities contributed. Masons shaped stone with patient hands. Carpenters raised beams. Laborers hauled and dug. Donations were collected from nobles and peasants alike. Some builders never lived to see the completion of their work, but that was not the point. These were structures meant to endure, to offer beauty, sanctuary, and a sense of heaven touched down to earth. And so the architecture of medieval life was not just about shelter. It was about shaping the world into meaning. From the low warmth of a cottage hearth to the vaulted heights of a cathedral ceiling, each space offered something beyond its materials. It offered rhythm, it offered comfort, it offered memory made visible. To walk among these buildings, to run a hand across the stone, to sit beside the fire, to listen to the echo beneath an arched roof, is to listen to the past speak softly. And in those walls, in those beams, the breath of those who came before still lingers. In a time before trains, before maps were commonplace, before the hum of engines filled the world with motion, the medieval road was a thread of earth and intention. It wound gently across hills, traced riverbanks, crossed forests, and passed under the weathered arches of stone bridges. Travel in the Middle Ages was not fast, nor easy, but it was constant. People moved, always. They walked, rode, sailed, and wandered, out of necessity, out of curiosity, or out of faith. And wherever they went, they carried stories, hopes, and a sense that the road itself could shape the soul. The paths across medieval Europe were varied. Some were well-trodden Roman roads, remnants of an older empire, their stones uneven, grass pushing through the cracks, but still reliable. Others were muddy tracks carved through woods and fields by carts and feet. The quality of roads differed wildly from region to region. In summer, they were dusty and dry. In winter, they churned to mud, sometimes impassable. Still, the network was vast, and people knew the way, not through signs or instructions, but through memory, stars, and the spoken wisdom of those who had walked it before. Travelers included more than merchants and nobles, though many people spent their entire lives within a few miles of home. Others were surprisingly mobile. Peddlers walked from village to village with sacks of needles, ribbons, and trinkets. Jongleurs and minstrels moved in search of audience and coin. Masons and carpenters traveled where work called, often finding lodgings with those of their craft. Messengers carried letters for kings, bishops, and merchants, trusted not only with parchment, but with secrets. Even peasants might journey for market days, seasonal work, or the rare pull of something unknown beyond the next hill. But of all who traveled, pilgrims moved with the quietest purpose. Pilgrimage was more than travel. It was a sacred undertaking, a journey of devotion and surrender. Across Europe, people walked for weeks or months toward holy destinations, the shrine of St. James at Santiago de Compostela, the tomb of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, the relics of saints in Cologne, or the great cathedral cities of Chartres, Rome, or Jerusalem. They walked for healing, for forgiveness, in thanks, or simply to feel nearer to the divine. Pilgrims were easy to spot. They wore simple cloaks, broad-brimmed hats, and carried staffs carved smooth from use, a badge or token, a scallop shell for Santiago, a Canterbury cross, or a palm from Jerusalem, marked their destination or intent. Many traveled in groups, for safety and companionship. Along the roads, shrines and crosses reminded them of their path. They stayed in hospices or monasteries when possible, where a warm meal and bed might be offered in exchange for prayers or service. Sometimes, locals offered hospitality freely, believing that to serve a pilgrim was to serve Christ. The journey was rarely comfortable. Pilgrims endured cold nights, swollen feet, hunger and danger, from bandits, from wild animals, from sickness. Yet they pressed on, singing hymns, praying softly, and telling stories to pass the miles. The road itself became a teacher, a space of reflection where one's burdens might lessen with each step. Arrival at a shrine was often marked by tears, not of pain, but of release. To light a candle, to touch a relic, to kneel in silence was to bring the journey inward, to find stillness at the journey's end. Beyond pilgrimage, other forms of travel left their mark. Trade routes connected towns and distant ports. The Hanseatic League ferried goods across the cold waters of the North and Baltic seas. Italian merchants rowed caravans to Flanders. Ships moved slowly across the Channel, carrying wool, wine, spices, and silver. Along these paths, inns and taverns sprang up, places of noise, warmth, and company. They were waypoints where travelers rested, gossiped, and learned the mood of distant lands. Letters, though rare and precious, also traveled. Couriers on horseback carried sealed messages across kingdoms, slipping between castles and abbeys, leaving behind news that rippled through corridors of power. These written messages were slow, but powerful. A marriage proposed, a war declared, a child's birth announced. In an age without instant communication, a single letter could change a life. And always the roads themselves bore witness. They remembered every hoofbeat, every wheel's turn, every silent prayer whispered beneath a breath. They passed by villages that welcomed and watched, by ruins overtaken by moss, by streams where the thirsty paused. Every mile was a quiet teacher, of patience, of humility, of the vastness of the world and the smallness of the self. To travel in the medieval world was not escape, it was transformation. Whether for work or worship, trade or trial, each journey was a letting go, a release of routine, a stepping into the unknown. And though the world beyond the village could be dangerous or difficult, it was also full of wonder, new dialects, new landscapes, new faces, and the ever-present reminder that no path is walked alone. And so, along dusty roads and forest paths, beside rivers and across wide fields, people moved, slowly, steadily, drawn not just by destination, but by the quiet pull of becoming something more than they were when they began. There is a persistent myth that medieval people lived in filth, that they avoided bathing, scorned water, and wrapped themselves in grime. But, like many echoes of the past, this image is a distortion. While the Middle Ages did not possess modern plumbing or chemical hygiene, people of the time did not live without care. They valued cleanliness, even if it looked different from ours. Water, in all its forms, from rivers and rain to heated basins and public baths, was not feared, but gently folded into daily life. In the village, water came from the well, often located near the center of the settlement. It was a gathering place where women, children, and neighbors met in the early light. With wooden buckets or clay pitchers, they drew cool water from the deep, carefully lowering the rope, hearing the echo, and lifting it steadily to avoid spilling. The well was both practical and symbolic, a source of sustenance, of community, and even of blessing. Its stone edges were worn smooth by hands, by time, and by the ritual of return. Streams and rivers also served as vital sources. Laundry was often done at the riverbank, with garments soaked, scrubbed with ash or lye soap, and beaten gently against flat stones to loosen the dirt. The process was not solitary. Women gathered here as they worked, laughing, sharing stories, and offering advice. Clothes were laid over bushes or hung on lines to dry, fluttering like silent flags of ordinary life. For many, this communal rhythm was as much social as it was sanitary, a moment of connection in the heart of routine. Bathing itself was not absent. In fact, many towns and cities across medieval Europe had public bathhouses, known as stews in England or balnea in Latin. These establishments varied in style, some modest, others ornate, but they provided warm, shared spaces for washing, relaxing, and even conducting quiet business. Water was heated in large copper kettles, poured into wooden tubs or stone pools, and mixed to a comfortable temperature. Visitors undressed, bathed alone or with companions, and were often attended by bathhouse workers who helped scrub backs, rinse hair, or massage sore muscles. Bathhouses were common enough that even clergy occasionally debated their morality, not because of the bathing itself, but because they were places where social boundaries blurred. In wealthier homes, private bathing was possible. Wooden tubs, round, deep, and bound with iron hoops, were filled with water warmed over the hearth. Herbs like lavender, mint, or rosemary might be added to the water for fragrance and mild healing. A servant might assist, pouring water from a jug over the bather's shoulders or bringing fresh towels. These baths were not daily, but they were regular, often weekly, or more often in the warmer months. Between full baths, people washed their hands, faces, and feet daily. A basin and pitcher sat near the fire, and cloths were kept clean and at hand. Soap existed, not the scented bars of today, but a mixture of animal fat and lye, sometimes softened with herbs or clay. In Muslim and Mediterranean regions, soap making was a refined craft, producing bars of olive oil soap that cleaned gently and left the skin soft. These soaps made their way through trade into European homes, especially among the affluent. Others made do with simpler local blends, often homemade, often rough, but effective. Cleanliness was not only physical, it was spiritual. The church emphasized washing as part of preparation for prayer. Before entering a chapel, monks washed their hands and faces at stone lavabos, shallow basins carved into the monastery walls. Pilgrims cleansed themselves before approaching relics. Anointing the sick included both spiritual and physical washing. Water was seen as purifying, a way to approach God with humility and respect. Still, full-body bathing did decline in some parts of Europe during certain periods, especially during waves of disease, when public baths were feared as places of contagion. During the Black Death and other plagues, physicians warned against opening the pores, believing that water could allow corrupted air, or miasma, to enter the body. Windows were shuttered, and perfumes or flowers were used to cleanse the air instead. But these were moments of fear, not norms. For most of the medieval period, people sought water when they could, valued freshness, and took pride in a clean home and body. Clothing helped too. Linen undergarments, soft, breathable, and easy to wash, were worn close to the skin. They absorbed sweat and oils, protecting the outer garments made from heavier wool. These linens were laundered frequently, often boiled, dried in sunlight, and aired out. A clean chemise or shirt was a quiet comfort, a signal of care, of order, of well-being. Scent played a role in daily hygiene. People used herbs, flowers, and aromatic woods to freshen both body and home. Sachets of dried lavender or rosemary were tucked into chests and worn in pouches. Some chewed parsley or cloves to sweeten the breath. Even streets were occasionally sprinkled with herbs to mask less pleasant odors in towns and cities. And so, despite the legends of filth, the truth is softer. Medieval people lived close to the earth, yes, to mud, to animals, to weather, but they were not indifferent to cleanliness. They washed their hands before meals, they bathed when they could. They scrubbed, swept, laundered and combed. They valued water not only for survival, but for the small sense of renewal it offered. A basin filled at sunrise, a bath warmed at week's end, a cloth gently pressed to a child's face. Cleanliness, like so much in the medieval world, was a balance of resources, of belief, of rhythm. And in the quiet act of washing, many found not only comfort, but calm. As the last light of the sun dipped below the distant hills, and the final shadows stretched long across field and road, the medieval world slowed its rhythm. The soft hum of labor faded. Tools were returned to their places. Hearth fires were stirred one last time, and the day, with all its effort and repetition, surrendered to the stillness of night. In a world without electric light, darkness was a familiar companion, not something to be conquered, but to be moved through gently, with respect and care. Evening began not with clocks or countdowns, but with nature's gradual dimming. The sky shifted from gold to grey, and finally to the deep velvet of night. Stars appeared slowly, one by one, overhead. In the village, doorways were closed, shutters drawn, and animals gathered into pens. A lantern might be lit to guide the last steps of the evening. A boy fetching water from the well, a woman checking the gate, a man making his way home from the edge of the field. These final movements were soft and purposeful, like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Inside the home, light came from fire and flame. The hearth remained the central glow, its embers banked to last the night, its heat gently radiating into the room. Beside it, candles were lit, small flickering guardians made from tallow or beeswax. Tallow candles, more common and less costly, burned with a faint scent of animal fat and smoke. Beeswax candles, prized for their sweet aroma and cleaner flame, were often reserved for churches or wealthier households. Oil lamps also glowed in corners, their flame dancing above a wick floating in olive oil or rendered fat. The quality of light shaped the mood. There was no bright overhead glare, no sudden illumination. Instead, light moved in pools and shadows, soft halos around faces, golden reflections on wooden walls. People sat close together, leaning in to see, to speak, to listen. Stories were shared, songs hummed, hands occupied with final tasks, mending, spinning, peeling fruit for the morning. Children lay nearby, half asleep, listening without meaning to. The home became smaller, cozier, more intimate, a haven in the deepening dark. For many, night brought not fear, but calm. It was a time for reflection, for prayer, for whispered conversations. Before bed, some families gathered to recite the Lord's Prayer or Hail Mary, their voices low and steady. Others simply sat in silence, letting the day settle around them like a woolen cloak. The church bells, if nearby, might sound for compline, the final prayer hour of the day, calling the village to close its eyes with faith and gratitude. Sleep in the medieval world often came in two parts. The idea of sleeping straight through the night was not common. Instead, many experienced what was known as segmented sleep. After dusk, people would retire early, shortly after nightfall, especially in winter, and enter a first sleep that lasted a few hours. Then, during the quiet middle of the night, they would often wake naturally for a period of restfulness. Some prayed, some meditated or read, if they had access to books and candlelight. Others tended the fire, spoke softly with a loved one, or simply lay still reflecting. This in-between time was peaceful, a gentle scene between waking and sleeping. Afterward, they would drift into a second sleep that lasted until dawn. In towns and cities, curfews were sometimes enforced. Bells rang to signal that it was time to extinguish lights and clear the streets. Watchmen patrolled, lanterns in hand, calling out the hours. But even in villages, there was an unspoken agreement. Night belonged to quiet. Footsteps softened, voices dropped, dogs slept curled beside the door. The world became for a while a place of rest. Dreams were taken seriously. They were not dismissed as nonsense, but often seen as messages from God, from saints, from the soul itself. Some kept dream books, recording symbols and their meanings. A dream of water might signify renewal. A dream of flight, freedom or temptation. Bad dreams were countered with prayer, or protective charms hung beside the bed. A carved cross, a pouch of herbs, or the invocation of a saint's name. Sleep was not just a physical necessity. It was a space of mystery, of encounter, of subtle transformation. Beds varied in comfort. The wealthy slept on high wooden frames with feather mattresses, canopies and fine linen sheets. The poor made do with straw-filled sacks or wool blankets, laid on benches or the floor. Children often slept beside siblings, curled like puppies for warmth. The hearth's glow dimmed slowly. A final ember sparked, and sleep, warm, layered, and unhurried, came without summons. And so the medieval night unfolded, not in terror, but in trust. It was a time to rest from toil, to let the mind wander, and the body mend. It was sacred, in its own quiet way, a gift renewed with each sunset. And when morning came again, as it always did, the world would begin anew, rising from darkness into light, just as gently as it had once folded into sleep. In the wide sweep of medieval life, beneath the vaulted ceilings of cathedrals, across the furrows of village fields, behind the worn wooden doors of homes, women moved steadily, shaping the world not with proclamation, but with presence. Their lives were woven into every rhythm of the day, rising early, carrying water, grinding grain, nursing children, tending gardens, preparing meals, weaving cloth, healing the sick, praying with folded hands. They were rarely at the center of recorded history, but they were always at the center of lived experience, shaping families, stewarding tradition, and enduring change with a quiet resilience that held the fabric of society together. A woman's life in medieval Europe was shaped early by expectation. From childhood, girls were taught by example, watching their mothers work, absorbing the gestures and timings of daily tasks. By adolescence, most were already contributing, spinning wool, kneading dough, helping younger siblings, or assisting in the care of animals. Marriage often came young, sometimes by choice, often by arrangement, and with it came new responsibilities. The management of a household, the bearing of children, and the endless weaving of work and care into something that resembled stability. In peasant communities, women worked beside men in the fields. They planted, harvested, weeded, and gathered. They hauled bundles of firewood, milked goats, carried baskets to market, and returned to knead the evening's bread. Their labor was constant, but not without rhythm. Seasons shaped their duties, and within that cycle there was space for storytelling, for laughter, for shared wisdom passed across generations. Elder women held respected roles as midwives, healers, and keepers of herbal knowledge. Their hands knew the properties of chamomile, the timing of birth, the signs of illness, and the remedies that could be coaxed from soil and leaf. Inside the home, women governed the domestic world with calm efficiency. Meals did not appear from ease, but from skill, knowing when to boil, when to bake, how to stretch one hen into 3 meals. They spun thread, wove cloth, mended garments, and managed the family's small store of resources. A scrap of linen was not discarded, but repurposed. A leftover crust was soaked into broth. In their care, nothing was wasted, and everything found use. Through these small acts, women sustained the home, not just physically, but emotionally, creating a space of familiarity, warmth, and order in a world often marked by uncertainty. In towns, women also worked in trades. Some were merchants, selling goods in market stalls. Others were brewers, weavers, bakers, or midwives. Widows sometimes inherited their husbands' businesses and continued to manage them with skill. Guilds occasionally admitted women, especially in textiles and food trades. Though their legal rights were often restricted, their economic roles were real, quiet but essential contributions to household and community wealth. In noble households, women's lives followed different patterns, but carried their own weight. A lady of the manor managed estates in her husband's absence, overseeing accounts, negotiating rents, resolving disputes, and ensuring the proper running of the household. She was expected to be educated, to speak with grace, to write letters, and read religious texts. Her duties were not merely ceremonial, they required judgment, leadership, and diplomacy. Behind the stone walls of great halls, many women wielded real power, not through force, but through care, negotiation, and strategic alliance. Some women chose religious life. In convents, they found a space for learning, contemplation, and service. Nuns prayed at regular hours, taught children, tended gardens, copied manuscripts, and offered aid to the sick and the poor. These cloistered lives were not without challenge, but they offered stability, literacy, and a measure of autonomy. Some abbesses became respected figures, managing large lands and corresponding with bishops and kings. The walls of the convent did not enclose them from the world, they gave them the space to shape it quietly from within. Throughout all levels of society, women were central to spiritual life. They lit candles, kept saints' days, passed down prayers, and carried religious stories in memory and voice. They guided children in faith, honored the dead, and prepared the home for holy days. Their devotions were not loud, but steady. Their faith, like their labor, was stitched into the seams of daily life. Motherhood, of course, was a defining experience for many. It brought both joy and fear. Childbirth was dangerous, and loss was common. Yet the love between mother and child was fierce and grounding. Songs were sung softly beside cradles. Small hands were taught to fold in prayer. Through sleepless nights and seasons of scarcity, women remained patient, resilient, adapting, enduring. Women also found expression in art and language. Some were poets, mystics, or visionaries, their writings preserved in letters, hymns, and diaries. Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Christine de Pizan, voices that still echo. But many others created quietly, embroidering tapestries, composing lullabies, telling stories by hearthlight that carried through generations. Their creativity was not always recognized, but it filled the world nonetheless, in color, in rhythm, in kindness. Though constrained by laws and customs, women were never absent from history. They shaped it from within, not always with titles or swords, but with memory, with care, with daily acts that carried civilizations forward. They were the breath in the lungs of the village, the hands that rocked the cradle and harvested the grain, the hearts that carried grief and joy with equal grace. And so, in every corner of medieval life, women moved quietly, but powerfully, resilient, rooted and radiant, with the kind of strength that does not need to announce itself to be felt. In the hush between nightfall and sleep, when the fire burned low and the wind whispered through wooden shutters, the medieval world told its stories. Not all were sacred. Not all were written. Many lived only in voice and memory, tales passed from grandparent to child, neighbor to traveler, spun beneath the moon or beside the hearth. These were the stories that shaped how people understood the unseen, the flicker in the woods, the turn of fortune, the whisper of fate. In a world where the line between the known and unknown was soft and shifting, folklore filled the quiet spaces with meaning. Magic, to medieval people, was not always grand or dramatic. It was subtle, woven into the textures of daily life. A sprig of rosemary above the doorway to ward off illness, a ribbon tied around a wrist to protect a newborn, a stone kept in a pocket for luck. These small acts, part superstition, part tradition, lived comfortably alongside Christian faith. The church might warn against sorcery, but for most people, these folk practices were not rebellion. They were reassurance, quiet rituals that helped people feel less alone in a world filled with mystery. Seasonal changes held powerful meaning. Each part of the year brought its own beliefs, its own set of practices and protections. The turning of the seasons was not just a shift in weather, it was a passage between worlds, marked by rituals that blended the natural and the spiritual. Spring arrived not only with blooming fields, but with May Day dances and green garlands hung over doorways. In some villages, the May Queen was chosen, a girl crowned with flowers who symbolized new life and the fertility of the land. Young people danced around the maypole, its ribbons weaving and unwinding with laughter. Herbs were gathered before sunrise, believed to be at their strongest, and rain on May Day was thought to bring fortune to crops. It was a time of lightness, of emergence, of songs sung beneath blossoming trees. Summer solstice, the longest day, carried its own aura. Bonfires were lit on hillsides to honor the sun's strength. People leapt over flames for luck, drove livestock between twin fires for protection, or walked barefoot through morning dew to ensure health. This was a night when the veil between worlds felt thin, a time for love charms, dream interpretation, and staying awake until dawn to feel the fullness of the light. Autumn brought a quieter magic. As fields were harvested and days grew shorter, people turned inward. At Michaelmas, the end of the harvest was marked with feasts, the baking of special breads, and thanks offered for the year's yield. But it was also a time of caution, when spirits were believed to wander and care was taken to protect the home. Samhain, the Celtic festival that would later mingle with All Hallows' Eve, honored the dead and watched for omens. Candles were lit in windows, offerings left at thresholds, and stories of ghosts told in low, reverent tones. Winter, with its long nights and deep cold, was a season of memory and mystery. Yule logs burned to bring warmth and ward off evil. Evergreens, holly, ivy, fir were brought indoors as symbols of endurance. In many homes, these plants were not just decoration, they were protection. Mistletoe was hung to bring harmony. Salt was sprinkled at thresholds. Dreams during the 12 nights of Christmas were believed to hold special meaning, a glimpse of the coming year, wrapped in the quiet of midwinter. Alongside the seasons, the landscape itself was filled with story. Woods were not simply trees, they were places of transformation, where travelers might lose time or find themselves changed. Streams could cure or curse, depending on the hour and the intention. Stones held memory. Mountains watched. Caves whispered. Even animals carried lore. A cat crossing one's path. An owl calling at dusk. A fox circling a house. All were signs to be interpreted, watched or warded. Folk healers and wise women, sometimes called cunning folk, were sought in times of trouble. They carried knowledge of herbs, charms and ancestral remedies. Their skills were respected, though occasionally feared. Most did not claim to wield dark magic, but rather to know the old ways: when to harvest vervain, how to ease a fever with thyme, what to say when tying a protective knot. Their homes were visited quietly, their instructions followed with care. They were not outside the village. They were part of it, living at the edge of acceptance, but essential when mystery came too close. Children heard these tales young. They learned the names of local spirits, the will-o'-the-wisps that danced above marshes, the fairy rings that must not be stepped into, the old stone in the woods where wishes were whispered. These stories were not just entertainment. They were maps, guiding behavior, teaching respect for things not fully seen. And they comforted too, offering reasons for things that had no explanation, and patterns in the randomness of nature. Even dreams were part of this lore. Dreams of teeth might warn of loss. Dreams of birds could foretell news. A dream before dawn was thought especially true. People awoke and spoke their dreams aloud, trying to unravel what the night had revealed. Sometimes they sought the help of a wise elder who would listen, nod slowly, and offer a meaning drawn from years of memory. And so the folklore of the Middle Ages was not a thing apart. It was the soft undercurrent of daily life. It flowed beneath the rules of church and crown, offering comfort in uncertainty and imagination in the unknown. It reminded people that the world was alive, not only in body, but in spirit. That every hill, herb, fire, and shadow held a story waiting to be heard. In these stories, in the flicker of candlelight and the hush of winter nights, medieval people found connection to their land, to their ancestors, to the mysteries of time. And though the words may shift, the feeling remains that in every age wonder walks quietly beside us, if we know how to listen. In the medieval world, time did not move in numbers and minutes. It moved in circles, like the turning of the plough, the waxing of the moon, the return of the swallows each spring. Time was felt, rather than measured. It was experienced through change, the length of daylight, the scent of earth before rain, the way the wind shifted at harvest. For those who lived close to the land, the passage of time was not a mechanism ticking forward, but a rhythm returning, a cycle of light and dark, growth and stillness, feast and fast. The year was divided, not into 12 modern months, as we know them now, but into seasons and saints' days, festivals and fasts, labor and rest. Each period carried its own flavor, its own pattern of tasks and rituals. The agricultural calendar was one of the primary measures, not just of work, but of life. In spring, fields were plowed and seeds scattered by hand, pressed gently into moist soil. In summer, crops grew tall, meadows were mown, and fruits ripened in orchard and hedgerow. Autumn brought the harvest, grain cut with sickles, threshed and stored, apples pressed for cider, root vegetables pulled and cellared. Winter was a time of repair, of spinning and storytelling, of looking inward. Every labor had its season, and every season was marked by holy days. The liturgical calendar, shaped by the church, offered its own rhythm, overlaying the cycles of nature with sacred meaning. Advent began the Christian year, arriving with the darkness of December, inviting patience, hope, and preparation. Then came Christmas, not only a day, but a season of 12 nights, filled with song, story, and candlelight. Epiphany followed, and after it, the slow slide toward Lent. Lent was a season of stillness, 40 days of fasting, reflection, and renewal. It shaped daily meals, quieted celebrations, and encouraged confession. Then came Easter, the turning point, bursting forth with brightness and alleluias. It brought not only liturgical joy, but seasonal relief. The earth awakened, flowers bloomed, days grew longer, the year had turned. Ascension and Pentecost marked the late spring, and through the long stretch of summer came saints' days, each one a pause, a moment of remembrance, a reason to gather. There was the feast of Saint John the Baptist, celebrated with midsummer fires, the feast of Saint Mary in August, when herbs were blessed and fields praised. Michaelmas arrived with the harvests close, marking the turning toward winter. These feast days acted like stepping stones through the year, each one anticipated, remembered, and celebrated with both devotion and delight. Some were solemn, others were merry, accompanied by games, dancing, or special foods. Each village had its own customs, its own blend of sacred and local, and through them, the year felt not linear, but layered, made not of abstract days, but of familiar moments, names, flavors, and songs. Time of day was measured less by hours than by activity. Sunrise marked the beginning of labor. Midday came with the church bell's toll and a pause for food. Evening fell when the light slanted low and the tools were set aside. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, tess, sext, none, vespers, and compline, structured the day, especially in monastic life. These prayer times, marked by bells, gave shape to the passing hours. Even in towns and villages, the bell tower echoed across rooftops and fields, a signal heard by all, not just the monks, but the mothers, the bakers, the shepherds, the weavers. Sundials, water clocks, and candle clocks existed, but were used sparingly. Most did not own timepieces. Instead, people told time by the sun's position, the shadow cast by a doorway, the feeling of the air, the sound of birds. After sunrise, before high sun, just before vespers, these were the phrases that framed the day. Time was approximate, but deeply felt. It lived in the body, in hunger, in weariness, in the instinct to rise with the dawn and rest with the stars. Nature was a clock of its own. The first frost told when to dig the last roots. The blooming of hawthorn marked the arrival of May. The migration of geese signaled the coming of cold. Timekeepers watched the sky as much as the ground. They read the moon's cycle, its waxing and waning guiding planting and gathering, its fullness lighting the fields at night. The stars, too, were guides. Certain constellations appeared only in certain seasons. The sky was a moving calendar, ancient and true. Even life itself followed its own turning. Birth, childhood, adulthood, old age, each stage marked with rites and memories. The cycle of life mirrored the cycle of the year. A child born in spring was seen as a sign of renewal, a death in winter, a returning to silence. Everything moved in circles, even sorrow would soften, turn, and pass. And so, the medieval sense of time was not ruled by precision, but by presence. People did not hurry from one thing to the next. They moved with the season, with the bell, with the quiet intuition of enough. Their lives were shaped not by control of time, but by relationship to it. They worked when it was time to work. They rested when the sun told them to rest. And through it all, the year moved like a wheel, slow, sure, and always circling back again. To live in medieval time was to live in rhythm, with the land, with the divine, and with the self. In the stillness of a medieval village, where the same faces greeted the day and the same hands baked the bread, the arrival of a stranger stirred the air like a change in wind. It might be a merchant with sun-darkened skin, a pilgrim bearing a badge from far-off Compostela, or a juggler from across the mountains. Whoever they were, they came wrapped in the scent of distance, the hint of roads untaken, of languages not yet heard, of stories full of names no one in the village could pronounce. And through them, the world beyond crept softly into even the most tucked-away corners of Europe. Most people in medieval times lived close to home. Their world was defined by familiar paths, seasonal routines, and inherited knowledge. But that didn't mean they lacked imagination, or that the rest of the world was unknown. It simply meant the world arrived in pieces, in goods, in faces, in stories whispered in marketplaces. A woman might wear a wool cloak dyed with indigo that had traveled from India, even if she'd never seen the sea. A child might grow up hearing tales of dragons in Persia, deserts in Egypt, or the vastness of Cathay, even if their feet had never left the village path. Travelers brought more than trade. They carried curiosity. They moved knowledge. They blurred the edges of what was thought to be fixed. Jews, Muslims, Christians, people of all faiths crossed paths in ports and cities, along trade routes and pilgrim roads. In some places, they lived side by side. In others, they met only briefly, with wonder, with caution, sometimes with tension. But even brief encounters left traces, a new spice added to a stew, a new song hummed on the way to the fields, a new word slowly absorbed into the local tongue. The great trade networks of the medieval world carried silk, spices, glass, paper, and metals, but also stories, drawings, customs, and fears. The Silk Road snaked eastward through deserts and cities, linking the markets of Europe with the palaces of China. Ships set sail from Venice, Genoa, and Marseille, riding the Mediterranean winds toward Constantinople, Alexandria, and ports of the Levant. Overland, merchants crossed snowy passes into Central Asia, returned with Persian carpets and tales of Mongol camps. These journeys took months, even years, but their impact lingered long after the footsteps faded. Markets in great cities like Paris, Cairo, Baghdad, and Constantinople shimmered with variety. And as traders returned, they brought strange objects: glass beads with unfamiliar patterns, textiles embroidered with unknown symbols, perfumes distilled from plants that did not grow in local soil. These goods entered noble halls and humble homes alike. A noble might scent their linen chest with musk brought from the east. A monk might illuminate a manuscript with lapis lazuli from Afghan mines. A peasant might hear a tale in the tavern of ships with square sails and golden idols, and pass that story to their grandchildren. Stories, above all, traveled farthest. They passed mouth to mouth like fire caught on wind. Legends of Prester John, a Christian king said to rule a distant paradise, filled the minds of many. Tales of lost cities, monstrous races, and lands where the sun never set captured imaginations. These were not tales of science or certainty. They were maps of possibility, of what might lie beyond the next ridge, the next ocean, the next prayer. And yet, the unknown was not always embraced. Difference could be unsettling. Foreigners might be met with suspicion. Unfamiliar beliefs could spark fear or rejection. The medieval world was deeply shaped by religion, and deviations from the known order could be seen as dangerous. Heretics, outsiders, and those who worshipped differently were sometimes cast out or worse. But even so, these tensions coexisted with curiosity, a paradox that repeated throughout the age: fear of the unknown paired with longing for it. Pilgrimages and crusades were moments when the world pressed closer. Pilgrims returned changed, speaking words from other tongues, bearing tokens made by other hands, having eaten food cooked with foreign herbs. Crusaders, though part of violent campaigns, returned with stories and goods that reshaped tastes and knowledge in Europe. The very idea of the exotic was born from these encounters, not yet romanticized but already complex. Port cities were especially porous. In the harbors of southern France, Sicily, or the Iberian Peninsula. One could hear Arabic, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin in a single afternoon. Ships arrived from distant shores, unloading goods and ideas alike. Scholars translated ancient texts from Arabic into Latin, reviving medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. A young student in a Paris cloister might learn geometry from a book once copied in a Baghdad scriptorium. The world was connected, even if the lines between were long and sometimes broken. For those who never traveled, these connections were felt in subtler ways. A feast day meal might include cinnamon, a tapestry might depict elephants, a tale of distant marvels might be told on a winter night, eyes wide around the fire. The idea of elsewhere was always present, both thrilling and mysterious, distant and yet close enough to taste in a cup of wine or glimpse in a carved ivory comb. And so the medieval world was not as closed as we often imagine. It was open in spirals, not in speed but in depth. Not everyone moved, but everyone felt the ripples of movement. The world beyond was not just across the sea. It was in the next village, the next language, the next story carried by a stranger through the fog. To encounter the unknown was to be reminded that the world was vast, layered, and filled with others who dreamed, worked, believed, and wondered. And in those encounters, no matter how brief, something quietly changed. A new word entered the local speech. A new color entered the local art. A new story was told and listened to with a pause of quiet awe. No era ends all at once. It does not fall like a curtain or vanish with the toll of a single bell. The Middle Ages, often imagined as a static or sealed-off world, was always changing, slowly, patiently, like a tree growing in a sheltered courtyard. And by the time the 15th century arrived, the winds of change had already begun to stir. They touched the edges first, the pens of scribes, the whispers in marketplaces, the roots of trade, and then slowly moved inward, reshaping how people lived, believed, and imagined their place in the world. Many of these shifts were born of hardship. The Black Death, sweeping through Europe in the mid-14th century, changed everything. It left fields untended, villages hollow, and families broken. But in the wake of so much loss, something unexpected emerged: space. With fewer people, there was more land, more work to be done, and in some places, a quiet rebalancing of power. Laborers could ask for better wages. Artisans moved more freely. Old hierarchies bent, if only slightly. The great chain of being had frayed, not broken, but loosened just enough to let in a breeze. Trade flourished in the wake of these shifts. Markets grew livelier. Cities, once small and scattered, expanded. Florence, Bruges, London, Venice. Goods from distant lands became more familiar: silk, sugar, pepper, books. The world, once so local, began to stretch. The compass and the astrolabe opened the seas. Printing presses, still a whisper on the horizon, would soon multiply voices. A single book, once the work of a scribe's lifetime, could now be made in days. Ideas, once slow to spread, would soon move with startling speed. In the realm of thought, too, a quiet transformation unfolded. The monasteries that once guarded learning now shared it with a broader world. Universities bloomed in cathedral towns. Scholars began to look not only to heaven, but to earth, studying medicine, motion, anatomy, and the patterns of the stars. Classical texts were rediscovered, translated, and studied anew. This wasn't a rejection of the sacred, but a widening, an invitation to see God, not only in scripture, but in the intricacies of nature, the elegance of geometry, the brushstrokes of painting. Art itself began to shift. The flat, symbolic forms of earlier times gave way to softer light, to perspective, to human emotion captured in fresco and canvas. A face now looked out from a painting, not only as a symbol, but as a soul, tender, real, familiar. Music, too, became more layered, more expressive. The world was becoming fuller, more textured. The divine was still present, but so too was the human. And still, the people of this time did not feel they were stepping out of an age of darkness. They did not look back and see shadow. They looked around and saw continuity. Bread still needed, bells still rung, children still born and baptized in the quiet rhythm of the village. They saw saints on their walls and stars above their rooftops. They still walked to church in candlelight. The shift was not a sharp turn, but a soft unfolding, a door opening slowly on its hinges. Even politics changed. Old feudal bonds weakened, kings claimed more centralized power, borders shifted, wars reshaped landscapes. The 100 Years' War, the rise of new dynasties, the push and pull between lords and commons, all of it stirred the still waters. Yet through it all, the memory of the past remained, not discarded, but carried. For those living through this time, the future was uncertain, but the past was always close. The old stories were still told. The saints were still honored. The turning of the year still brought candles, flowers and song. What was changing was not the heart of life, but its edges, its tools, its pace, its sense of space. Some mourned the passing of old ways. Others leaned quietly toward what was coming. Most simply adapted, as people always do, holding on to what mattered, letting go of what no longer fit, and trusting somehow that the rhythm of life would continue. And it did. The end of the Middle Ages was not a fall, it was a transition, a slow turning of the wheel, a deep breath before the next chapter. The world was not waking from sleep, but shifting in its dreams. The same sun rose, the same stars turned, but beneath them, new thoughts were being born, new maps were being drawn, and the people still planting, still praying, still singing as they walked the roads, carried it all forward. They did not know the name of the age to come, but they had lived, deeply and fully, in the one that was now gently passing. The sun rests low on the horizon now, spilling its last warmth across the rooftops. A golden hush settles over the village, that tender space between light and dark, between labor and rest, where everything softens. You walk slowly down the narrow path, your footsteps light upon the packed earth, past hedges shaped by careful hands, and doors gently drawn shut for the night. This is not a place of drama or grandeur, it is a place of repetition, of gentle stories, of quiet dignity, lived one day at a time. A curl of smoke rises from a cottage chimney, bringing with it the scent of peat and herbs. Inside, a mother hums softly to her children. Bread has been broken. Hands are being washed in warm water. A candle flickers on the table, casting shadows on the low ceiling beams. The same lullabies that soothed her once as a child now flow from her own lips, passed down like precious heirlooms. The rhythm of life continues. Nearby, a man secures his tools under a lean-to. He brushes dirt from the wooden handle of his hoe, not with frustration, but with practiced care. He has worked the same field for decades. He knows the weight of each season. He can feel the coming frost in his knees, smell the turn of weather on the wind. His work is not loud, but essential. It feeds, it sustains, it steadies. Farther up the lane, an elderly couple sits outside their doorway, wrapped in woolen shawls, their silence companionable. They listen to the sounds of nightfall, the bleat of a sheep being coaxed into its pen, the distant whistle of a kettle, the faint laughter of youth on the far side of the village green. They have heard these sounds all their lives, and yet they never tire. The comfort is not in novelty, but in return, the way everything familiar becomes sacred when it endures. A small dog trots past, tail low, as if on one last errand. A child waves goodnight to a neighbor from an upstairs window. The church bell tolls gently, not to summon, but to settle. Its echo moves through the village like a sigh, inviting everyone to rest, to reflect, to remember that the day, like the year, has come to its gentle close. You pass by the chapel now. The door stands open. Inside, a single candle glows near the altar. The pews are empty, but the space is not. It holds memory. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, songs, the whispered hopes of countless prayers. You do not need to enter to feel its peace. Just being near is enough. Past the chapel, the path winds toward the edge of the village, where fields stretch out into the coming dark. There, the land lies still, breathing beneath a blanket of mist. The trees rustle softly. A fox watches from the hedgerow. The stars begin to pierce the deepening sky, one by one, like familiar names returning home. You pause, you listen, you breathe. This world, so old, so ordinary, is no less beautiful for its simplicity. It is a world of small gestures, bread baked, wool spun, songs sung at dusk. Of stories carried not in books, but in hands, in voice, in ritual. Of people who lived with the land, not above it. Who shaped time with prayer, with planting, with patience. Who believed not in conquest, but in continuity. And now, the walk is done. You return, in your mind, to your own warm room, your own soft resting place. But something of this village stays with you. A quietness, a rhythm, a sense that the past is not far behind, but gently walking beside you. Its stories are not lost. They are here, in the hush of evening, in the flicker of a flame, in the hush before sleep. Let the world slow. Let your breath deepen. Let the voices of those long past settle beside you, not to speak, but simply to be near. Their lives were not perfect, but they were full, and in remembering them, their work, their wonder, their ordinary grace, we remember something of ourselves. Close your eyes now. Let the stars come. Let the night carry you, gently and without hurry, into dreams that echo with candlelight, distant bells, and the timeless rhythm of a village at peace.